A very good morning and apologies, first of all, for the delay that we've had this morning. And thank you very much for joining us. My name is Siphumelele Zondi. I lecture here at the Durban University of Technology in the Media, Language and Communications Department. And I am going to be your program director for this morning. My task is very easy, actually, because we have your esteemed speakers right at the front who are going to be taking us through the journey of our conversation on the South Africa and the USA political tensions. And I'm sure that we've realized that in the last couple of months, probably the last couple of years, there's been stuff that's been simmering in between, but these relations between South Africa and the United States of America go beyond our democracy that is 31 years old. And it's relations that go back about 200 years from the 1800s, moving on to the 1920s, different relationship under colonial rule to apartheid to now this current democratic dispensation. And perhaps maybe we need to think about the future of those relations as well, because at the moment everyone is also talking about the economies of the two countries. We do know that President Donald Trump of the United States this year did implement tariffs on South Africa and other countries across the world. There have been a lot of questions about the AGOA process, that's the Africa Growth Opportunity Act, that was implemented in the year 2000, so that's 25 years old, which opens up South Africa to the American market and other markets across the African continent to the American market. And then this year, as President Donald Trump of the United States of America was to take over as president, first, before he took over, about 2 or so days before he took over as president for the second term, announced that there were some very bad things that are happening in the country that is South Africa. At the time, he did not mention what those very bad things are, and then as time went on, he then mentioned issues of farmers who are white and Africans, and issues of land as well. We do know that land is a very contentious issue in South Africa, and the history of land in South Africa. And then we did see those 49 who then went over. The media has gone on and done its own research, and it turns out that some are not even farmers. Some are in IT and all sorts of things, but they are farmers nonetheless, according to the President of the United States of America. And there's also then been an issue of Starlink as well that started last year. We did hear that as recently as yesterday. There was one company that was selling Starlink or Starlink kits in South Africa that's now been shut down. And they closed shop yesterday. And we did hear ICASA saying that it's illegal in South Africa. But before we get into those conversations and what's been happening and the history of South Africa-US relations, the present of South Africa-US relations, what's expected for the future, we do have the MEC here as well. And we do have academics here as well who are going to engage with us. But let's call on Professor Furufero Etuera, who is the Executive Dean of the Faculty of Management Sciences, to welcome us here as we are here because of him.
Thank you so much, Siphumelele, for those short descriptors of what's been happening in our space, specifically in relation to the US and South Africa's relations, and we are very happy. Number one, we want to apologize for an empty hall. We should apologize because we called you from very far away to engage with the university community, and you've got an empty hall in front of you. I hope there, online, we've got a lot of people who are ready, eager, and willing to engage. But we also take cognizance of the fact that a few of our students, or majority of our students, are currently writing exams. So as I was walking in here, There are quite a lot of buses that were offloading students down there by the road. I hope that as soon as they are done with their lectures, they will be able to come through, because we really want to keep the university campus a vibrant space for our students and our academics. But equally, I think our academics should have filled the hall, engage with us, share ideas about what's going on and what is possible in our relationship with the entire world. But we have with us important individuals who have insights regarding international affairs, regarding South Africa and the US, and regarding specifics associated with US-South Africa relations. As Zondi was indicating, matters associated with AGOA, Starlink, and so on and so forth are very pertinent to this conversation, and we hope that our colleagues will indeed address those issues. Spumelele Zondi will facilitate the engagements. Nevertheless, we will have keynote speakers in the form of Honourable Mmusi Maimane, who just came in. I'm sure you all know Mmusi Maimane, the former leader of the DA, and of course he runs a different movement currently. And we have Francois, Honourable Francois Rodgers, sitting here next to him. He too will give us another keynote. So we are honoured to have 2 keynotes. Thereafter, on the basis of the keynotes provided, we will have very fascinating conversations that are going to be led by the following panelists. Professor Ntsikelelo Breakfast, very well known in South African media, social media, and public media. Professor David Munyae, very well known, especially for those who do China, BRICS, and related research work. He comments on that a lot. Professor Zamunku Tlembandwa from DUT, who also is a formidable commentator on SABC and other broadcasting channels. He will share with us his thoughts around the keynotes provided, and specifically on the theme. We have Dorcas Tang, who's the director of the Peace Studies here at DUT. We look forward to hear from you. And of course, we have Dr. Thandiwe Kumalo, who is the head of legal studies here at DUT. We also have, last but not least, Victor Ajokorotu. Ajokorotu. I must pronounce this way. Victor Ajokorotu. Thank you and welcome. We must pronounce your name properly, otherwise you are going to scold us. We don't want the scolding. So, colleagues, please feel free to engage as vigorously as you possibly can. Let us really analyze the question of South Africa and its relation with the globe, and in relation with the US in particular. And let's hear insight from our formidable members, panelists, and keynote speakers. Zondi, over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof. Netwera. And I do believe that the room is going to fill up slowly. I do see feet walking in as we progress, and it is Africa after all. If you saw in the beginning, we were less than we are, and slowly we're filling up. And also the wind and the weather, because we do hear that in parts, in fact, it's quite windy outside, but in parts of KZN there has been snowfall, and maybe people are also slowly trying to sort of like do a litmus test and do a finger test to say, is it safe to step outside? Otherwise, we hope that they will also have a thriving engagement with us that's going to be taking place online. nonetheless, we will go ahead with our conversation. We will start with Honourable Mmusi Maimane, who is the leader of Build One South Africa. We do know that Honourable Maimane has been in youth activism. Pretty much has been in politics and activism, we can say, all his life. Through the youth stages, he dabbled in TV presenting at a point in time and then went back to politics, different formations, until he's built this home that he has founded, which is Build One South Africa. He is a member of Parliament in the Republic of South Africa. A round of applause for Honourable Mmusi Maimane.
Sanbonani dumelang goe more molweni abshin. Good morning. It's genuinely my great privilege to be here today. We had to make special arrangements to be here. My delay was really facilitated by the fact that we were I've got the ESCOM board accounting to our committee, which I chair, and so they needed to give their financial reports for this year. So it was good to at least engage that. So I'm grateful to be here. It's also good to see Honourable Rodgers, whom I've known for a very long time, and appreciate being able to share this platform with. And then when I saw the list of panelists and the various degrees, I thought I did not come here just only in my capacity of politics. You will be the first to know I come from the University of Johannesburg, where I'll be graduating with a PhD in a few weeks' time. So you can change my title also. I don't know if it's helpful to have a PhD in politics. That's a debate for another day, whether just being able to be critical is helpful in politics. I must lament the fact that I think KZN, you have certainly delivered on whether that is unconstitutional. And this will require that we really have an inquiry. I thought when I go back to Parliament, I'll certainly raise the weather in KZN. Our discussion today really focuses on South Africa and the US. All of us were glued to our televisions when we watched the engagement between President Ramaphosa and President Trump at the White House. I would argue to say that was a culmination of perhaps maybe a decade of challenges between us and the United States. It culminates at a time where never and never before have we faced such profound geopolitical uncertainty, really presented before us by a conflict that took place in Russia, Ukraine, Israel and Gaza, and certainly instability in multiple regions. It is a crisis that has brought upon a deeper sense all over the world of a lack of predictability. Policymakers all over the world are now starting to wonder that the idea of long-term planning must clearly be substituted by strategic thinking. Because at the end of the day, elements and uncertainty put us in a space where we have to constantly adjust. And as I was flying in this morning with all the turbulence, I thought to myself, no greater symbol could indicate the state of the world that we are in. We face profound, with the introduction of President Trump, tariff wars. We have delivered to South Africa a fairly chronic uncertainty around its economic fortunes. Many people ask the question, why would President Trump have such a profound focus on South Africa? As a trading partner to the US, relative to their own size of economy, we're not in the top turn in terms of our own exports to the US. But for us, they represent the second highest trading partner. And that trade operates in our favor as South Africa, as we are net benefactors of the trade balance between us and the United States. our inherent focus being on vehicles, iron, steel, aluminium, agriculture, these products are inherently needed for our economy to be able to thrive. The number of jobs that we described, the billions and billions of US dollars that would be traded between the two, mean that whether you and I accept it or not, our relations with the US happen to be crucial. I think I hear it a lot in the Twitter streets, or is it called now X streets, where often people are on that space saying, abahabe. And in that instance, referring to the fact that the US can go jump. I would argue the fact that before you become so bold about that statement, be conscious about the extent of job losses that a US exit would mean for South Africa. Along with that, we also have profound cooperations between us and the US as it speaks to our defense and our technology. One of the key discussions that I thought perhaps was missing in that famous meeting at the White House was a discussion around the Falkland Islands. The reality of it is that, in part, and maybe Professor Munyai will speak about this, the relationship between South Africa can never be not understood in the absence of who controls the Falkland Islands. President Xi of China has already gone out to make a pronouncement that these should be in Argentina's hands, who are now part, in many ways, of the BRICS relation countries. The Britain has taken a stance, when Liz Truss was then president, to say we certainly completely reject any questions of the sovereignty of the Falklands. This is an important and a strategic defense area as it speaks to both the United States and South Africa. And so in many ways, we have to recognize the fact that not only do we cooperate on the basis of trade, there is a huge dynamic opportunity in South Africa's strategic location as it speaks to the notion of defense. There can be no debate about the fact that our digital interface is connected with that of the US. And when people are suspicious in whether technology being put here in South Africa will not have the ability for data harnessing for other international markets, they are not far gone or mistaken in that question as they put it forward. And therefore, fellow South Africans, this question about us in the US can never be at a more profound level at a time such as this one. 10 years ago, I happened to go to the Senate House in the US. I was invited to the Africa-US Portfolio Committee. I went in there enthusiastic. You know, when you come from South Africa and you arrive in the US, you bring with you your Madiba magic. You honestly believe you are there to represent Nelson Mandela. And so when you walk in the room, you have, you know, that vavavoom, that sense of you are doing something here. And then the question I put forward to the committee, what are your thoughts about South Africa, this great nation? And what struck me in all of my enthusiasm, the question was put before me, what Nelson Mandela? Who are you guys exactly? Deflated as I felt on that day, I had to ask the honest questions. Have our relations with the US been best served by the number of ambassadors that we have sent to the US? I would argue that has not been the case, and our engagement with the US in the last decade has not been top of mind for many legislators who sit in the United States of America. So the culmination of President Trump is not an accident. It is a function of the fact that I believe, as a government, we neglected our relation with the US with almost the underlying mantra that says, to be anti-West is to be progressive. That thesis in and of itself has translated in a number of key actions that have meant that in some ways our relationships with the United States of America have soured. It did strike me in observing that meeting that whatever came out of it, South Africa did not have an ambassador in the US, still does not have an ambassador to the US, and ultimately our trade envoy, who was recently appointed, was not in the room of such a serious discussion. A few weeks ago, I was in Ghana discussing the very same subject, and the words of Kwame Nkrumah came back to me. That perhaps maybe as Africa, we need not look west or east, we need to look forward. And therefore we need to begin to reset, and this is where I stand with President Ramaphosa, on our relations with the US. To achieve that, a number of critical steps need to be taken. I think we need to reset our diplomatic outlook. We have a significant benefit as Africa in a population of 1.4 billion citizens that sit here. Africa will be endowed with minerals that will help us transition into a more greener economy. Therefore, without a shadow of a doubt, Africa will be what the next decade will be defined by. And if South Africa begins to think of itself in the context of the continent at large, I believe we can then begin to argue a better case about how we engage both the US and China. In fact, I would argue that even the configuration of BRICS needs to be able to include a number of African states, notwithstanding Nigeria, Egypt, which represent the top 3 economies in the continent. Were we to achieve that, we could create a different language in terms of how we engage geopolitically. And I would say the first reset of South Africa in its diplomatic focus must be the resetting of its relation to the rest of the continent. We have an opportunity to benefit from. The Africa Free Trade Area gives us a great opportunity, but this gives us a space, a base, to not speak of only 60 million citizens, but to speak really of a population dividend of 1.4 billion. The second is that in our trade relations with our US and our global partners, we need to ask the question, how do we develop a fund that is inherently looking at how we improve on capital formation in the continent in South Africa? The one thing that cannot be easily guarded by regulation is the question that says, how do we improve trade and investment between the US, South Africa, and as it relates to the rest of the continent? We achieved that. We are able to harness institutions like BlackRock, asset managers, etc., to be able to improve the rate of investment here in South Africa. Tomorrow, Parliament will be debating the budget or the fiscal framework. We'll discuss GDP, we'll discuss debt, but the one thing we will not discuss is gross capital formation, which asks the question, what is the rate of foreign direct investment into South Africa and domestic investment? I would argue, if we put that at the forefront, we begin to put forward positions that hold us as Africans to say, this is a future of investment. And when populations are dying all over the world, or birth rates are reducing all over the world, Africa still has a net positive birth rate, and Africa is where your next set of labor, your next set of skills, your next set of minerals, and more crucially, a continent that can fast industrialize in order not only to export agriculture to the world, but to be able to beneficiate its own minerals so that we become a crucial trading partner all over the world. To do that, as I've stated, it's going to be important we establish an Africa Fund. It is going to be important that in our relations with the West, we create a space where we have our own rating agency. It is not helpful for economies in Africa to be rated only by Moody's, etc. We need an Africa rating agency that's able to monitor and measure how well we do in terms of our own ability to calculate the value of our assets. This will be important in terms of how we move capital in the continent. Furthermore, I would argue we need to have a skills revolution in the continent. The diaspora that's sitting all over the world needs to be able to feel that this is a place upon which wealth can be created and exported elsewhere. And in South Africa, we can learn from multiple technologies that have been developed in places like Kenya, etc., that are able to give us the space that when we do bilateral negotiations, we speak as a collective of Africans, of which South Africa is a significant part of that. As economies transition, it is going to be important for South Africa to deal with its own energy sustainability. I spoke to President Ramaphosa and made it quite strong. Said to him, Mr. President, it's fine for you to stand up and say, we will not be bullied. But what I would urge us to do is that let us build the sovereignty of our nation. Because were we to get around to that, we create resources, we create energy security that allows us to trade better. It cannot be that a country like Greece, for argument's sake, whose economy over a number of years has fluctuated backwards and forwards, the cost of capital in Greece is less relative in interest rates than the cost of capital here in South Africa. I was in Ghana, and when you look at how much businesses need to borrow in order to finance their businesses, their interest rates are levied at close to about 32%. Now, no one is going to invest within that climate. It is then our duty to create a sense of Africa investment that gives us the opportunity to move capital, transition into a greener economy, figure out how we use our resources in a sustainable manner so that our sovereignty isn't dependent on any other grants, but really we can raise our own capital domestically. COVID taught us a very important lesson. It taught us the question about what we do around pharmacology. And I would urge that Africa needs to be able to develop its own patents in order to resolve the question of vaccines and what pharmacology we put on the continent. Because as we were debating whether it should be Pfizer, etc., it became quite clear that we'd be importing vaccines in US dollars rather than being able to maximize the patents that sit here. I then close with the idea that as PEPFAR is being withdrawn, Africa needs to be able to deal with its own health security. As viruses don't have boundaries, if we build our own pharmacology, recognize the fact that as a continent we are interconnected, we can then begin to put a different message to economies like the US, like China, like India. Fellow Africans and fellow South Africans, the reset of our relations needs urgent and deliberate work. And my mission and the work that we're doing is about asking the question, what regulatory framework do we put? And I heard the previous speaker speak quite eloquently about things like Starlink. Now, Starlink is technology that is available and can have many different variants all over the world. But the one thing we have done is, in response to Starlink, we ask the question, what are the regulatory issues that you need in South Africa that we can help you with? And even in our laws around transformation, we can talk about equity equivalent, which is language that wasn't always common. I still challenge the idea that the same benefit must be given to South African companies. We must broaden our economy to be more inclusive, but offer as much regulatory certainty so that investment, the idea of gross capital formation, can be put on the table. So yes, the Africa-US relations are important. Yes, South Africa is a net benefactor of the trade balance. Yes, we can cooperate on defense, and on our diplomatic corps, we need to ensure that we have an ambassador in the US sooner rather than later and enhance our trade envoys. There's no certainty about the future of AGOA, but ultimately, if we as South Africans begin to articulate our trade priorities, we can do what Nelson Mandela said, that our foreign policy must be based on human rights and on trade. Lastly, yes, we must digitize globally to ensure that our interactions all over the world gives our young people an education to compete with a child anywhere else, and allows us to be digital citizens in being able to trade globally. And lastly, if we're able to attract the diaspora of skills that sit all over the world, I really do believe the future is Africa. And therefore, no greater time, and I want to thank the Durban University of Technology for opening up this dialogue, for giving us the opportunity to be able to think not only just about what is domestic, but then to say, let us reset, but let us reset on our terms that allows us to paint a future of Africa. And as Steve Biko closed, he said, ultimately, what we offer the world is also a human face. that in our cultural exports, in our ability to relate to the world, we can create a sense upon which we can give a far more human face. Fellow Africans, I think there's a moment, and that moment is now. If the GNU doesn't seize the opportunity, I certainly want to warn and say that if South Africa does not act and act fast, countries like Kenya, countries like Rwanda, countries like Ghana, countries like Egypt will quickly be able to deal with the opportunity that presents. Let's make sure every citizen in this country, whether in a farm or in a street, is safe. Because when we do that and we act on policing, we can attract investment that ensures that ultimately the jobs that are here in this country and the people of this nation can prosper collectively. I thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much for that, Dr. Maimane. And there are quite a lot of takeaways, and hopefully our academics in the room as well can respond to some of those. But essentially, it's Africa going at it as a unit, and as opposed to the little blocks that Africa. And it's quite interesting when we speak of that in the year of Japa, for example, the era of Japa. But maybe these are conversations that we can have as we proceed. Our next speaker is, I almost said professor, because I see very many professors on my list. It's Honourable Francois Rodgers, who is a member of the provincial government here in the province of KwaZulu-Natal and the MEC of Finance in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. Born in Pietermaritzburg, and then it did very many things before starting a number of businesses, especially in the Kokstad region of KwaZulu-Natal, and also working there to sort of like in the reformation of the Chamber of Business in that particular town. And he's been the leader of the Democratic Alliance in the province since the year 2021. So let's give a round of applause to MEC Francois Rodgers.
Good morning, everybody. Molo. I do live in Kokstad, and Kokstad is cut off from the rest of the world. I spoke to my wife this morning. She said it's a bit like COVID all over again. You can't get in or out of the town, and there's no electricity. So spare a thought for the people of Kokstad and what they're going through. Let me just put a disclaimer. You were going to call me professor. When I got the invitation, those of you that are my age or slightly below will remember there was a movie with Peter Sellers called The Party. I see some people are nodding their heads. Where as an actor he got an invite to a party in Hollywood by accident. With all the academics in this room, I feel I'm here by accident. But nevertheless, I have a background of auditing and a business background, and as you have heard, the MEC of Finance. So perhaps we could use the new phrase, shall we dim the lights and get started? And I thought I'd entitle my address as There's Something Rotten in the State of America. My humble apologies to William Shakespeare. Because listening to Mmusi is quite right. We have to be very careful how we proceed in this geopolitical climate, economic climate that we're in. Because Mmusi, the one portfolio that he holds that wasn't announced is he's actually the chairperson of the Appropriations Committee in the National Assembly. So Mmusi and I often sit with the National Minister and all the MECs of Finance, and we look at the fiscal situation in the country. And it's really not good. It really is in dire need of resuscitation. And I think we're making some decisions going into the right direction, to turn the situation around. But we need to be very careful, and we need to be cognizant of the fact that we're part of a global village, and we cannot and must not operate in isolation. And again, I think this attitude of, to hell with the United States and to hell with Donald Trump. You might dislike Donald Trump. I don't particularly like him. I don't particularly like his political beliefs. But that's my view. But we still have to do business. I serve in a cabinet in the province of KwaZulu-Natal, where I don't particularly like some of the people I have to serve with. But I still have a job to do. And I need to put my personal differences aside, and I need to get that job done. And I think that's the approach we need to take. Allow other people to use theatrics to drive their message. The one positive side on the debacle, which was referred to earlier in the White House, the one positive aspect is on the Saturday after that incident, I spoke to one of the delegates who was in the White House at the time. And what I found very encouraging was after the theatrics, after the lights were taken up again and not dimmed, there was a total change of attitude once the cameras were switched off. There was a positivity, there was a hospitality, and there was a common understanding of some of the challenges that we collectively face. And that's the type of approach that we need to take. But like Mmusi, I was also glued to my television. My blood pressure was sky high at the time of the dimming of the lights and the theatrics. But you know what? I walked away from watching that as a proud South African. Forget about your political ideology. Forget about what political party you represent. I thought that the collective that was in the White House from South Africa did us absolutely proud and proved once again that South Africa is a country to be reckoned with. Now, as KwaZulu-Natal, we have very little direct influence on the geopolitical tensions and influences that are unfolding, but rather we remain susceptible to trade storms and the consequences thereof. And for the purposes of today's engagement, I'm trying to focus on the potential challenges facing KwaZulu-Natal, consequences, opportunities that the current situation presents. Because as Churchill stated, never let a good crisis go to waste. One of the aspects I've taken out of the last couple of weeks and Donald Trump's reforms is that we can't be doing business as usual. Things are changing. And if we continue to do business as usual, we're going to end up the loser. That means we've got to start looking at other opportunities and other possibilities. Even as a provincial government, such as KwaZulu-Natal, we can't be reliant on what's happening at a national government level. So, let me give you an analogy. Having taken over the Treasury now in the province, we also face critical cash and budget challenges. But the reality is, in the accounting field and the Treasury field, we take previous year's expenditure when we do our budgets, we add a CPI inflationary rate, and we say that's our new budget. Well, that's why education is in a crisis. That's why health is in a crisis. That's why social development is in a crisis. Because we take historical expenditure, we add CPI and we say that's our budget. Because spending pressures and demands have changed over the years. So we've got to do things differently when it comes to both budgeting and when it comes to how we deal with the global situation and trade partnerships. So it's fairly common knowledge now that the US is introducing their 30% import tariff without any real investigation into South Africa's trade policies. Instead, according to the Office of the US Trade Representative, the tariffs were designed for each US trade partner, including, of course, South Africa, by calculating the US trade deficit in goods trade with the country as a percentage of the country's exports to the US. It then offsets the tariff at half of the resulting percentage, apparently because the tariffs implied by its actual methodology would have meant that in some cases tariff increases would have been 50%. For South Africa, in fact, on that formula, we would have moved up to 60%. The new 30% US tariff on South Africa exports to the US are not based on any standard formula used to calculate tariffs that another country imposes on US goods, but rather on the trade patterns between the two new countries. So if we look at our exports, and according to the Economics Trading 2025, the total value of South Africa's exports to the rest of the world were valued at 110 billion US dollars. That's in 2024. Of this amount, approximately 8.2 billion rand came from goods destined for the US, which contributes about 7% of the total value of our exports. The key SA products which we export include mineral resources, agricultural projects, manufacturing goods. Also, according to Trade Economics, the total value of iron and steel exported to the US was around 506 million in 2024. Over the same period, exports of vehicles to the US were around 1.4 billion, and data from trade and investment in KwaZulu-Natal showed that SA exported precious metals, vehicles, aircrafts, and vessels worth around 55 billion and 34.7 billion in 2024, which accounts for 35.1%, 22.1% of the total South African exports. Disturbingly then, on the 30th of May, we'll recall that President Trump announced that his administration was going to double steel and aluminium tariffs to 50%, although no specific date was applied. The decision to increase tariffs even higher will cripple the already battling steel industry in South Africa. And we need to look no further than one of our steel producers in Newcastle, ArcelorMittal, which is already under severe stress because of power generation problems, labor issues, and of course cheap Chinese imports into our country. And there, if we see the end of that, that's 3,500 jobs that we stand to lose between Gauteng and KwaZulu-Natal. And that's certainly something that we want to avoid. In 2024, the value of goods exported by KwaZulu-Natal reached the 17.86 billion and accounted for approximately 10% of the total national exports. This amount includes 9.8 million, 2.3%, for iron and steel, and 609 million for motor vehicles. Consequently, the proposed increase in tariffs is likely to have a negative impact on the KZN economy, particularly in the automotive industry. Sugar is another area, and it's one of our sub-industries that will be adversely affected by tariffs. The US market is vital for South Africa's sugar exports, and any increase in tariffs could jeopardize the livelihoods of many people. And as we know, it's a huge industry in the province of KwaZulu-Natal. If we look at the imports, our imports are mainly machinery and equipment, chemicals and pharmaceuticals, and agricultural commodities. In KZN, the value of total imports from the US in 2024 was estimated at 14.4 billion rand. The most common commodities that KZN imports from the US are manufactured items at 13.357 billion rand, comprising coke, petroleum products, nuclear fuel, and a makeup of 66.7%, which make up 66.7% of the 8.9 billion rand of total manufactured imports. So where to from here? What do we do? Well, we need to look at the diversification of our export markets. As I said earlier, we can no longer do the same thing over and over and expect a different outcome. Expanding our trade relations with other countries and regions can reduce our reliance on the US market. Strengthening partnerships with emerging economies could help mitigate any potential market losses. One of the areas that I believe is absolutely underutilized in the province of KwaZulu-Natal is the beef industry. Now, between the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal, we're the two provinces with the biggest industry of beef. The demand from Russia, the demand from China, and the demand from the United Arab Emirates on beef we could never sustain between the Eastern Cape and KwaZulu-Natal. That's how big the demand is. What have we done about it? Nothing. What's happened? We've now got foot and mouth disease. Now, China just recently banned all imports from South Africa on beef and beef-related products. So, cloven-hoofed animals. So if there's any skin products, any leather products, it's all banned. It's stopped. Now, that's an enormous loss. But South Africa as a whole is quite lucky. That ban has just been introduced. Take a guess how long KwaZulu-Natal has had a ban on any beef exports because of foot and mouth disease. 4 years. For 4 years, we have not been able to export beef products. Now, that can't be business as usual. We cannot accept or continue to neglect the opportunities of trading elsewhere and ensuring that we create jobs and build an economy. There is a sustainable economy that's waiting. If we talk about building rural economies, that's it. It's there. It needs political will and it needs the drive to be able to implement it. We need to invest in local industries. Enhancing domestic production capabilities can foster economic resilience. Supporting small and medium enterprises creates jobs and enhances export capacity to other destinations. Which is also why we've undertaken as Treasury in KZN with the new public-private partnership legislation that's out there to engage with business, to look at partnerships with business. Where we don't have the financial or the skills to be able to implement some of our projects, we need to be forming partnerships, because those partnerships come with the financial backing, they come with the skills to enable us to be able to build on our economy and, most importantly, create jobs and deal with poverty and inequality. And then, as Mmusi touched on, the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. We need to broaden the market of trade between our African partners by allowing duty-free imports and exports to 12 African countries at the first stage. This initiative is expected to boost South Africa's exports by 29% and adding an estimated 655 billion rand to our exports in South Africa. This must boost our local economic growth and foreign exchange earnings. Nevertheless, the 30% tariff is both unfair and unfounded. South Africa has virtually no capacity to respond in kind because it accounts for only 0.25% of all US trade. So although the tariffs are aimed at South Africa, they're also aimed globally. And they're aimed at some of the biggest markets across the globe. And as the old African proverb goes, when two bulls fight in the kraal, it's the grass that suffers. Ultimately, we are the grass. So if this trade war continues between China and the US, that in itself will also have a negative impact on South Africa. One of the other options is to play the tit-for-tat game and say to the US, well, because of many of the products imported from the US by South African, let's push up the import tariffs into South Africa. But I don't believe that that's the solution. I believe the solution is to sit round a table and look at what the demands are on all sides and come up with a way forward. So in closing, I'd like to say that we showed absolute mature leadership in the White House during the engagement with Donald Trump. And I think we need to continue on that trend. The fact that we also now have a government of national unity, I think also bodes well, in that it's not just one dominant party, but a multi-party government that watches what is happening with its partnership. There is accountability within government, which hasn't always been the case. I've seen it in KwaZulu-Natal. In the past, we had one dominant party who could do as it pleased. That doesn't happen in the cabinet of the GPU in KZN, because we're all watching each other, and we all want to make sure that whatever we do is in the best interest of the province of KwaZulu-Natal. So thank you very much, Nondaba. Yabule.
And thank you very much, the Honourable Rodgers. And also thank you for being here. As you mentioned that, because when I was driving here, I did hear on radio that the road to Kokstad, between Kokstad and Pietermaritzburg is closed, and then the other route as well is also closed because of the snowfall, which is bigger than the other parts. And so when you say that you had conversations and it's difficult to get out, thank you that you saw it fit to be here and participate in this engagement. And our next speaker is Professor Nontsikelelo Breakfast, who is with Nelson Mandela University. He's with the Center for Security, Peace and Conflict Resolution. Let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you very much. On a lighter note, I'm not Nontsikelelo. Nontsikelelo is a woman. I'm Tsikelelo. Don't take it to heart. Yeah. I think in order for one to critique contemporary specificities, one needs to invoke history, because the current world order, in my view, is the product of history. I think one of the gaps in the public discourse, and maybe also in the scientific community, is the fact that multilateralism, in my view, is the brainchild of the US. Because before the First World War, there were no multilateral institutions. The first multilateral institution was established by the US after the First World War by Woodrow Wilson. And of course, it was a project gone wrong, as some of you might know, that it failed to prevent the Second World War. And my argument is that the US, at some point in the early 1900s, did not take part in the affairs of the world. And I'm going to link my argument to the theoretical framework of Robert Cox, which is the method of historical structures. So my argument is that there was an epoch in the early 1900s at which the US did not get involved in the affairs of the world, right? And then after the First World War, the US abandoned its policy of isolationism, then got involved in the affairs of the world. And then things became worse after the Second World War, because it emerged with the Soviet Union as they emerged as political victors, right? And of course there was a political competition between the two. And Robert Cox developed a method called the method of historical structures, where he talks about the meaning of structures in the world order. And his argument is that the US has used three things to frame the world order. So the first thing that he talks about is material gains. By that, he's talking about the economic capabilities of the US. And I agree with him because I think that is linked to soft power. The second thing that Robert Cox talks about is ideas. Now, our understanding about political realities is as a result of what is reported to us by the media. So the media frames discourses. That's why Trump spoke about white genocide. He was doing that on purpose because the US has a history of believing its own propaganda. So he was not doing that by mistake, he was doing that on purpose. So that's the second element that embeds itself in the foreign policy of the US. The third element that Robert Cox talks about is institutions. And I want to argue that what the US has done after the Second World War was to establish the Bretton Woods institutions on purpose as a forum to propagate its ideology of neoliberalism and Americanism. So my argument is that the current world order is the brainchild of the US, and including actually NATO. NATO also, in my view, is the brainchild of the US. It was created during the Cold War. But what beats me about the posture of Trump at the moment is the fact that he has been quite reluctant to spend money on the security of Europe. I don't understand that because America is like an empire. If you have an empire and you want to entrench hegemony, you have to spend money. But I saw of late the US forcing NATO members, for the first time actually in the history of the US, members of NATO have been forced to increase their expenditure on the military of NATO out of their GDPs. That has never happened, but it has happened under Trump, which is quite interesting. Maybe other colleagues of mine can assist me in terms of what is the rationale behind the thinking of Trump in that regard. Now, the relations between South Africa and the US, they are quite interesting in my view. I share these sentiments of the previous speakers that we need to reset our bilateral relations. But I also think that as a country, we tend to punch above our weight. I think the straw that broke the camel's back between us and them was the grievances that we instituted, against Israel. I mean, I do appreciate the fact that what is happening between Hamas and Israel, is a violation of human rights. But at the same time, I think the thinking behind us instituting that grievance was not in good faith, and the timing of it. I know it's a sensitive matter, but I will leave it at that. I don't think that our government did that in good faith. I think we have a tendency to punch above our weight as a country. Because, you see, if we had done that in good faith, then the question that begs is, why do we apply double standards? There is a conflict which is underway between Russia and Ukraine. We say we are neutral there. But with regard to the conflict between Hamas and Israel, we've got a position. To me, that is applying double standards. Because if you have a principle, why not apply the same principle consistently, right? So look, I know the way some people are looking at me is as if I'm out of my mind. I am not saying that we should not pronounce on what is happening in the Gaza Strip is out of line, it's a violation of human. But the point I'm making is that if you've got a principle and you stand by that principle, you've got to apply it across the board. You can't chop and change and say, in this case, no, you're neutral, and then in other, how many conflicts throughout the continent which are at play where we don't pronounce on? Now, when one looks at our foreign policy, I'm trying to narrow down now my argument. When one looks at our foreign policy, my view is that our foreign policy was a product of the first conference of the ANC, which was actually held in your own backyard in Durban. The first conference of the ANC after exile, it was held here, isn't it? Yes. And the ANC adopted a policy document. And that document has been the foundation of the current foreign policy. And my view is that foreign policy is nothing else but how the state projects its domestic values on a global scale. You see, those constitutional values, when you project them internationally, in my view, that becomes our foreign policy, like human rights, rule of law, and so on. But like I said, I think we've been found wanting. One of the challenges of liberation movements is that they don't want to call each other out. You see, for instance, I am not sure that Frelimo, for instance, won the elections in Mozambique. I might be wrong. I don't think they won those elections. The one that there is a conflict that broke out there. I'm not sure if ZANU-PF won the elections in a way that is free and fair. That's why, for instance, I think Nangwangwa has been worried that liberation movements are shrinking now, meaning that he's next, he might be ousted, you see, because they are... I also think SWAPO, in the upcoming elections, will be booted out of power, you see. That's why, for instance, we don't call those leaders out because we've got historical links with them. So the point I'm making is that we tend to apply these double standards, but on a global scale, we say that we stand for human rights. I think there's something wrong with that line of thinking, in my view. I also agree with the colleagues who have spoken before me that we need to form relations with those who supported us during apartheid, but also we need to form relations with new friends. I agree with Dr. Mmusi Maimane. He made a very interesting point. Look, whether you like it or not, the US has the biggest market on a global scale. That's the big, it will be, I'm sorry to use this word, I'm going to use it. It will be foolish not to strengthen our footprint in that market. We're very much foolish. So we need to maintain our bilateral relations with the US while forming other strategic partnerships with others elsewhere in pursuit of our national interests. Now, just to look at the historical development of foreign policy covering the period of 1994 until to date, there has been a lot that has occurred. You know, if you look at the first foreign policy of Nelson Mandela, for instance, I think at that time we were trying to brand ourselves as a democracy. That's why we signed in 1998, we signed the Roman Statute for the creation of the ICC, not ICJ, ICC. We became a member there because we were trying to be a leader. During the time of Thabo Mbeki, we introduced African Renaissance, the peer review mechanism, NEPAD, even though there were issues with NEPAD, because some people say that, you know, NEPAD was a neoliberal project because it was introduced without a buy-in from a civil society. But I think we did well, and because of that, we were subsumed into G20. That's why, you know, I'm not trying to open a can of worms, but, you know, there is a long-standing argument whether is South Africa a United States of Africa or not. And my view is that it is not, but it is a pipe through which neoliberalism is channeled in terms of our geopolitical location. You see, that's why we were co-opted. You know, hegemon, many people, when they talk about hegemon, because we're talking about the US here, in relation to us. So the US has been trying to entrench its hegemony on a global scale, but many people, when they talk about hegemony, they think that hegemony is only about class domination. It's more than that. Hegemony is a multi-dimensional concept with a multiplicity of functions. The first thing that those who entrench hegemony do is to co-opt the subaltern class. The second thing is to assimilate. That's why I said earlier on, we were subsumed in the bigger scheme of things into G20. The third thing is to be made to conform to the agenda of the one that is entrenching dominance. So I don't think that we are United States of Africa. I think we're a pipe through which neoliberalism is channeled. Now, then we had the presidency of Jacob Zuma. There were interesting things that happened under Msholozi. Interestingly, Msholozi, he rose to power during the discourse on post-Washington consensus. I think it's Joseph Stiglitz who coined that. Some people use the term post-Washington consensus interchangeably, you know, with the Beijing's consensus, which is basically the whole notion of questioning the dominance of market fundamentalism, right? So I think under Msholozi, there was sort of like a paradigm shift in terms of our gravitation to the east. That's why we became members of the BRICS in 2010, yeah, I think South Africa became a member. It was the last member of the BRICS, not the new members that have joined of late. And then after that, we had President Ramaphosa. I think Dr. Mmusi Maimane spoke about the Africa Free Continental Trade, which was facilitated by President Ramaphosa. But also, I think, under the circumstances of COVID-19, we became the chair of the AU, which is a good thing. So there have been positive developments that have, okay, I agree with the view that one-party dominance is a thing of the party. Now, I'm going to open like a real can of worms now. You know, maybe it's good that, I'm sorry to say this, I hope I won't break the hearts of some of you in the audience. But maybe it's good that the ANC's hegemony has been dealt with a blow in a big way. Because I see some positive things now in Parliament, that those committees are able to hold ministers accountable, which is a good thing, right? But I don't think that foreign policy is a no-go area. Foreign policy must not be a no-go area. It must be debated. No political party in this country has won the elections. There is no clause in the Constitution that says that, I heard someone saying that, no, there is a clause in the Constitution that says foreign policy belongs to the president. There's nothing of the sort. Therefore, my argument is that I think foreign policy must be a reflection of all those political parties in that GNU. It cannot be a view of one political party, because it makes sense. Otherwise, if the ANC is continuing to entrench its hegemony on matters of foreign policy, then it means that the ANC has won the elections. Thank you very much.
All right, so that theme of hegemony is continuous on breaking hegemony in terms of where we stand as well, because it came up with Honourable Rodgers, who was saying that let's look at new markets. Dr. Maimane is saying that we should strengthen our relationships with Africa and go as a bloc instead of negotiating as individual countries and having so much dominance of the United States of America. And Professor Breakfast is also talking about that issue of hegemony, and starting here in South Africa with the ANC's hegemony being broken in leadership and in parliament, and saying let's further break that hegemony. Going to how we go into the rest of the world. But there was also an issue of foreign policy, but maybe we'll touch on that later, when there was questions on punching above the weight in terms of Israel and Palestine and not doing the same elsewhere. But which country ever does that? Where what's done in one part of the world is also done in other parts of the world, and looks at different conflicts in other spaces the same way. But someone who is an expert on international relations is Professor David Munyaye, who is the director of the Center for Africa-China Studies and an associate professor of political science and international relations at the University of Johannesburg. A round of applause, please.
Good morning. Afternoon. It is a great pleasure to be here. When I received the invitation, it was just one word. I think it's high time to decentralize discourse on most important issues pertaining to our lives. Quite a number of things that my colleagues have already alluded to. Professor Breakfast, we perhaps have to have another breakfast, you and I. But nonetheless, since we are in this platform, we have to engage in a way that is... when we talk about foreign policy, I think it is quite important, rightly, as some have already said, we have to have a history. Understand, there is no such a thing as ANC foreign policy. It's a national foreign policy. And this year is quite an important year for a number of reasons. Because we can go as far as back 70 years ago, 1955. The Freedom Charter. It was constituted by different groupings of people. It wasn't just ANC. Various people, multiracial gathering. And that document is the DNA of our foreign policy. You read it through, it speaks quite clearly that as we are fighting for freedom, it wasn't a question of freedom just in South Africa. It was a freedom across the world. And this year is also yet another important year, 70 years of an anniversary of the Bandung Conference that took place in Indonesia in 1955. At the establishment of Freedom Charter, as we were discussing, to say South Africa belongs to all who live in it, and South Africa shall seek a peaceful resolution to conflicts across the world, we did that in a unified and argued against an oppressive regime. And therefore, the gathering in Indonesia and Bandung Conference was more or less the same, but differ with the issues. If you pull out the communique of the Bandung Conference of 1955, it was only 10 years after the end of Second World War. The Bandung Conference made it very clear that the world we live in is unequal. The developing countries have no access to institutions of global governance, namely the United Nations and its agencies. the manner in which the UN is constituted, with only 5 permanent members, and Africa, Asia, Latin America with no appropriate representation. And when we talk about democracy, we can't just talk about democracy in vacuum, that democracy is to be practiced domestically, regionally, continentally, as well as at a global level. So we can't live in a world in which some preach democracy, yet they don't practice it. They continue to be members of Security Council, dictate to us what needs to be done without us. So I really do not see anything wrong with South Africa's foreign policy. It has been consistent since 1984. With mistakes here and there, no doubt about it. And I'll be the first one to say, perhaps timing and other things. But as to what the DNA, what we call the progressive internationalism, there is absolutely nothing wrong with it. It argues quite strongly that we need to balance the world we live in. And when we talk about human rights is not limited to casting votes. There's human rights of the ballot box and there's a human rights of the belly. And at all times, you have to balance. Where does democracy reside? Does it reside in the ballot box or it resides in the belly? So that question is what we are dealing with. That the real true democracy is the one that satisfied both the box voting after 5 years, just crossing a paper and throw it inside the box. But you can't do that if certain section of the country without electricity, without roads, with potholes. So we have to balance both. There are those who are religiously obsessed with one part of democracy. And some of us will say, as much as we love voting and putting papers in boxes after 5 years, we cannot eat that. We need food on the table. We need schools. We need clean water. We need bridges. We need sanitation. We need equality, access to the Constitution that is so great among many. So perhaps we need another conversation on these issues. Our core issue is foreign policy and recent issues that has happened in the United States. And that's what the organizers of this important gathering asked us to prepare. The bigger question that I ask myself is what kind of a world we're entering in. Our doctor-to-be, in a matter of weeks, and I hope you can wait until the hand of the Vice-Chancellor graces your head and will share with you. I'm particularly happy because you and I had a conversation in Italy. We were climbing a mountain and you were registering then. And to hear this news pleases me greatly. The big question that I have, which I would like just to pose, is that if we wake one morning, Third World War has just begun. Picture this. We all wake up, a global war has started, what will be our position? And I'm not sketching this as if it's something might not happen. It might happen this week. It might happen any day. What I haven't had is anyone to say, we as a country, our position in such a war will be A, B, C, and D. Why am I posing this question? As my colleagues have said, the world we live is unpredictable, it is fluid, it's really hard to understand who is who in the zoo. And therefore, I think it is a must for us to be very clear in terms of what kind of policy we have. We should not spend a great deal of time and energy to criticize President Trump, United States, Western world, imperialists, and all sorts of things that we say. We know what they stand for, and we should waste no time trying to understand. There's nothing to understand. President Trump, to understand him, you need to just Google the Project 2025. And Project 2025, the MAGA idea, it's exactly what happened in the White House. There is nothing that South Africa can do. We can send the best of the best brains. We can develop views of countering and reset or terms that we put. We're just wasting our time. It's a policy that is anti our own foreign policy DNA. Their foreign policy and ours are worlds apart. It is anti-diversity. It is anti all what we stand for in our foreign policy. And you tell me that you are going to convince. Now, having said that, and I want to be understood, I'm not saying we should abandon the United States. The United States remains the most important country in the world, #1 trading partner in so many areas, as alluded by the MEC, in terms of our goods getting into the United States. We have rich history with the African diaspora. Even in the anti-apartheid struggle, a number of constituencies within the United States are on our side, have always been, and will continue to be. So I think the question I'm posing is that we need to be very clear how we engage such a new administration that does not stand for what we stand for in the world. We cannot convince them to abandon their own view on us. But what we can do is to craft ours and adjust it to ensure that we lessen the dependence on so many key areas. And I'm glad to hear the MEC talking about the diversification of trade. We need to find alternative trade. We need to ensure that we send the MEC and so many other to countries such as Kazakhstan, to Philippines, Latin America, in areas that we're not trading with, who are looking for beef, who are looking for so many products that we have, while we're engaging in the United States and others, while we're pushing China, our closest trading partner, for them to open even more, to work with them, to understand some of the dynamics, including the foot-and-mouth disease. How can it be isolated? You cannot have one farm with foot-and-mouth disease and you block the entire province or the entire country. How we create those standards, I think that's what key. This requires technical skills, negotiation, understanding, and unity, more importantly, that we might differ in terms of which parties we belong to and views that we have. But when we speak on SA, South Africa, outside the country, We need to speak with one voice. We cannot continue to be bogged down in slogans and singing, kill this and kill that, and not putting in core things, add value on issues, on products that we can sell competitively on the world market. We need to engage scientifically, improve our education system. We ensure that the youth understand the fourth industrial revolution, understand the Starlink, and it's not the only. There are so many other satellite-based communication systems that are coming. How we can engage them for development. Also understanding the security risk that goes with these Starlinks. We saw what's happening in Ukraine war, that they are not just communication, they communicate weapons. They are used to undermine sovereignty, they are used to undermine and advance agendas other than our own. What kind of policies are we putting in place to protect our digital sovereignty, the space? Who are we working with? As much as we engage Starlink, I think we need to open to others and ensure that we're not dependent only on the United States. The day they switch, as they did Russia Today, when the Ukraine war started, we woke up one morning, Russia Today television is off. Why? Because Europeans, satellite in which it is placed, they just switched it off. So we can't talk of BRICS without understanding some of these dynamics, the kind of knowledge that we have as a country, as a continent. We are 1.4 billion Africans. How can we work together as Africans across this continent, reach the youngest continent with the youngest population? What's our contribution to global economy? It's much more deeper than what we think. We are contributing critical minerals. What are we doing with those minerals? Are we doing beneficiation? What policies do we have to ensure that we stop exporting raw materials to the world stage, and the very same raw material come back to us at a very high price, while we have all the products that we're talking about? We have uranium. We can't use that uranium. Rare earth. We have lithium. The future is going electric. So I think these are kind of conversation that perhaps we should have at the provincial level. Provinces have a right to foreign policy within the bounds of national foreign policy. And delegation can go all over the world at the provincial level in line with South Africa's foreign policy and engage other provinces of other countries, whether it's in Saudi Arabia, in Brazil, or any other. But we also have to understand that as BRIC countries, we also compete among ourselves. Brazil produces beef as much as we do. So the question is not us just producing beef. I think we need to ensure that we bring products that have more value and are very competitive. We transport. We are a unique country with two oceans meeting. We are important to the world for so many reasons, for trade, as in the past, and in the future. For the purpose of wars, everyone look here. Should there be world war, this passage will be critical. And therefore, we think we need to take advantage. To what extent? As much we talk about high moral ground, Nelson Mandela, and all what we say about our morality at the global stage, we need to strengthen our SANDF. You can't live on morality alone and thinking you'll be defended, and you're being pushed over by tiny countries such as Rwanda in the Eastern Congo. You need to have an SANDF that is well-trained, well-armed, need to ensure that you protect your deep waters. You protect and ensure that we talk about blue economy. We are able to use that and absorb unemployment, youth into those areas. You need security, not just for South Africa, but the entire continent. The coast that we have, the deep waters, which is being fished by so many countries. You are right here at the sea as you see it. There are so many other nations that are coming to fish, to steal what belongs to us, what belongs to the continent. I think these are kind of conversations. We can't have them alone. We need the SADC, we need the AEU. And I'm one of those people who even argue the so-called Indian Ocean, it shouldn't be Indian Ocean, it should be an African Ocean. We have more stake in that ocean than any other country in the world. The Atlantic is the same. And therefore, yes, the lights were dimmed in White House. There were a lot of discussions. My major point is that we need to take lessons from what happened in White House. These issues will continue. We need to ensure that we speak with one voice. We put our differences aside. We unite under one vision for the country. That is a very simple vision. How can we produce products that sell competitively? How can we work with the rest of the continent? And we can fight at home, but when we are at the international stage, you don't talk ill of your country. Americans, when they're here, LA is burning as we speak. You speak to an American today, they talk about their country first. With us, we send delegates, speak different language outside the country. We need to protect our country, we need to protect the continent. But we do that with key principles which are enshrined in the Freedom Charter, in what we fought for. That freedom for ourselves means freedom for Palestinians. It means freedom for Western Sahara. It means freedom for others who were like us, are under the yoke of colonialism. I think we can't forget that part. It has nothing to do with ANC, PAC, or any other. It's the DNA of our foreign policy. With or without the current government, that progressive internationalism must continue. And thank you.
All right, Professor Munyai went all over in terms of some of the issues that we can cover there. And hopefully some of those issues will be slightly expanded on during the Q&A session later on. But a new one that was brought into the conversation are issues of 4IR. We do know that we live in the era of artificial intelligence as well, which some have said is probably the biggest disruptor of our time and our foreseeable future as well. And what are we doing about that in terms of our digital sovereignty, especially when it comes to those issues. And now that relationship between Trump and Musk has soured. So what then happens after we started to have discussions because of Starlink and because they had a relationship that has now soured? So those are some of the conversations that we can expand on a bit later on. Thank you, sir. Professor Zamukuhle Mbandlwa is an associate professor in the Department of Public Management and Economics here at the Durban University of Technology. He's also been a visiting professor at Kampala University in Uganda, as well as HSC Public University in Russia. So perhaps he can talk to us about America and the East.
Good afternoon, colleagues. I will try to be very short. I understand that colleagues have been sitting down for long, and we still have other distinguished speakers to share their ideas with us. I will try to touch base on some issues that I think are very important. Well, I think I don't want to repeat what colleagues have already spoke about. I will probably talk about just a few things that I think need to be our point today, or our point of discussion. Right, I think we all agree that the relationship between South Africa and USA is very important. And even though it's important, we must also consider the fact that Africa is the future of the world. Simply because if you look at the statistics as we speak now, Africa is sitting at 70% of young people. And the world is aging, especially in Europe and in the other continents. So I think it's also very important to have a look at what can we do in Africa, and also what can be done by South Africa itself. And also, we cannot have a bad relationship between ourselves and the US, because as we speak now, if you look at the dynamics that we have, I'm actually trying to open my laptop here, it's failing me, but already I'll speak about the things that I've already prepared. So if you look at the relationship between South Africa and the US at this point is not good, and primarily because of the social media comments that have been made about South Africa, especially about the act and about the new act that was approved by the parliament or passed by the parliament last year, which then provoked a lot of conflicts between South Africa and the US. And I think because if we rely mainly on the media without understanding the facts, we can really make a lot of mistakes and conclude on things which we do not know. And I think this is the situation also with the US. They've made decisions about us as South Africans without us, relying on maybe one person or two people who might not have a full understanding of the issues of South Africa and South Africans in relation to the diversity of the country and the relationship between blacks and whites in South Africa, and farmers and the civilians in the country. I think those are the problems that we have. And also, if you look at the GDP as we speak, America is sitting at more than 27 trillion US dollars in the GDP, followed by China, which sits at around 17 trillion US dollars. Which then tells us that if we are not able to mend the relationship between ourselves and the US, as Dr. Maimane have said, we'll have a situation where a lot of people will be losing their jobs and we'll have serious challenges in the country. And also, if you look at the relationship between US and South Africa in terms of the health issues, the financial assistance that have been provided by the US to South Africa, many people will not be able to access treatment, and there are lots of things that are happening. But I had a discussion with some doctors who are my friends who are owning surgeries, and they've said maybe this is a good cause so that South Africans will stand on their own and they'll also be independent in dealing with such issues. But I think I have a different view, different views compared to him, because I think we cannot just say because we want to shift things then we must allow people to suffer, because a lot of people will suffer if we don't mend the relationship between us and the US. But also, our bilateral relations with other countries, particularly those who are in BRICS, is not genuine. I always say it's a relationship of convenience between the countries in BRICS and also with the US, but particularly with BRICS because countries in the global south share the same sentiments and the same economies and same views when it comes to how the economy must be transformed. I'm raising this because if you look at what is happening between South Africa and China, China is very good in production, and South Africa are not producing any significant products that can be utilized by the global community, and we can have funds out of those products that are produced. Like for example, In China, they are very good in technological gadgets that they are producing. But in South Africa, we don't even have a single company that produces a cell phone, for example. But we are friends with China. Why can't they come and establish plants here, train our people in South Africa to manufacture a cell phone, and then we can have our own South African cell phone that you are producing here? Because they have the skills, knowledge, and the resources in China, but they are our partners, but it's good for them to use us as consumers. If we need to produce and manufacture products, they are not there. They're just happy with us being able to just consume us. So these are the robust discussions that we need to have. And I think even the government itself need to know that we're not just comfortable by being consumers only, but we also want to have a bigger slice of cake in the global economy, whereby these partners must come and say, like for example, I read an article by Prof. William Gumede yesterday, if not before yesterday, where he spoke about the issues of the PE in South Africa, where he robustly discussed the issue of how the PE have failed South Africans, whereby about 100 people who benefited in the PE in the last 1 trillion that was used from 1994 up to date. And if you look at how other countries were able to transform the economy, it's very good compared to, for example, in India, for example. In India, they've introduced what you call Tata. Tata is an Indian car, manufactured everything by India. So they are not assembling the car, but everything, when it comes to Tata, is manufactured in India. So all the profits and the people on the ground are busy actually working on that project, and it's actually transforming the economy. It transformed the economy, and people have benefited a lot. And also, he made mention of Japan. In Japan, they are producing Mitsubishi. Because of the economy, they've also introduced that company, and they are doing very well. But in South Africa, we don't even introduce or manufacture bicycles, for example. So it's really something that we must look at. If we want to transform the economy, we must do away with the mentality of being the consumers. We're just consuming, we're not producing anything, but we have critical partners such as India, which, by the way, India is very good in the technology and in medicine. In fact, India is sustaining the global community when it comes to technology. Even the US rely on people from India. Even the CEO of Google or whoever that you can think that is prominent in the technology space is coming from India. So, and also in China, they are doing great, but they are not helping us because they want us to remain beggars, to rely on them, to engage with them, so that you can always believe that they are helping us. You know, there are people who can pretend to help you while they are stepping you at the back. So we need to have a look at that relationship. How can they make sure that we are producing products, we are not just consumers? But also, if you look at, in our case here in KwaZulu-Natal in Durban, we have what you call the harbour, the port here in Durban. Look at how many people that are benefiting there, and how can we then transform the economy of Durban? How are we making sure that people of Durban are able to be very influential in issues of logistics and issues of transportation? And if you look at if you have the list, if you get some time, go and search the list of prominent companies that are working in the harbour. You'll see that almost less than 5% of people are from Durban or from KwaZulu-Natal. So we need to make sure that we have a look at this and how our relationship with other countries are able to benefit South Africa, not just to be consumers. Thank you so much, Program Director. I hope I didn't use much time.
Thank you very much, Prof. So Prof, again, brings in a different issue of basically production when it comes to us not being consumers, and whether we can get help from those that we, I suppose, do business with. And I suppose disruption of that world order that was spoken about earlier, which we were told was determined by the United States of America. And our next speaker is Professor Dorcas Oyebisi Edang. Professor Dorcas Edang is an associate professor and acting director at the International Center for Nonviolence here at the Durban University of Technology.
Good afternoon. Thank you again to the organizers for this opportunity. I want to do two things in the next few minutes. The first is to reflect on the role of emotions in international relations, and after that reflect on South Africa and US relations. I remember yesterday I went to rewatch the activities in the White House. I rewatched President Zelensky and President Trump and President Ramaphosa and President Trump. And I think we need to acknowledge the role of emotions in international relations. And so that is the dimension I am taking in the next few minutes. So there's growing literature in this discipline that explores emotions on different levels of analysis. For example, we need to analyze political leaders' emotional responses. Various researchers have described emotions as complex psychological and physiological phenomena playing an important role in shaping human interactions. This underscores the critical importance of examining emotions, offering new insights into how states behave, conflict, and international cooperation. Wong argues that it would be impossible to think of any negotiation, including those that happen between leaders and officials in the world of diplomacy, that does not involve emotions. Bramson also writes that emotions play a significant role in shaping human interaction. Widmeyer notes that emotions can lead to economic crises. Economic crises can create policy reactions and even overreactions. So emotions inform the language used, the behaviors expressed, and the policies developed. When you have a powerful individual and you mix that with negative emotions, it can be disruptive. It can be destructive, it can lead to explosive reactionary outcomes. And so these negative emotions we've seen in the White House, from hate, anger, pride, resentment, fear, and even disgust, are presented through various mediums, in person and even on social media. Emotions can reflect discrimination. Emotions can inflect marginalization and exclusion. How does this apply to the dynamics and challenges with regards to the United States and South Africa? Before winning the US elections, an article suggested that if Donald Trump does become president, his affinity for anger and resentment will guide how he will act to other leaders. This will weaken the successful practice of US foreign policy and America's position in the world. He writes that when faced with negative comments, Trump tends to react immediately and with anger, without careful deliberation. Trump's emotional reactions could cause serious damage to America's relationships with its partners and friends. Former White House Communications Director presents an interesting take. He argues that Donald Trump is acting on whims. Whims are a sudden desire or a change of mind that is unusual or unexplained. McCarthy Jones raises the possibility that some of Trump's policies are simply spiteful rather than strategic. An article in The Conversation states that Trump's resulting anger may be driving him beyond selfishness into counterproductive spite. Spite is when one acts to harm another person or another country, in this case, even at a cost to oneself. Since his return to office, President Donald Trump's emotions and actions have led to an increase in trade wars and a very tense global environment. Some have described him as emotional, atrocious, a bully, comical, unfettered in speech and action, and lacking all rationality. An article in the British newspaper Daily Guardian describes him as vengeful, reckless, and his actions as disruptive, vindictive, illegal, irrational, and egotistic rampage. Negative emotions like these should not have a place in global politics, as it can create and escalate tensions and destroy relationships that should foster development, ensure economic growth, and build solidarity. Negative emotions like anger and emotional outbursts lead to language that antagonizes and demeans other political leaders. Emotions can fuel injustice and can polarize parties. If left unchecked, emotions can cause countries to go to war. So the case of South Africa and the US is an example of the intersections between emotion, power, and politics. Hall presents an important dimension involving power and emotion as it operates between conflicting positions or actors. One can argue that perhaps Donald Trump's emotions of anger, his quick decision-making, the lack of fact and evidence has defined and will continue to define its relationships with South Africa. A key point then is, how do political leaders manage their emotional responses when engaging with aggressive counterparts who challenge them? Positive emotions like empathy, concern for human suffering, peaceful engagement, compassion, and respect for human dignity should drive diplomatic efforts and initiatives. Foreign policy players should express emotions that build relationships, embrace dialogue, and joint problem solving. Emotions can be tools for positive communication, collective mobilization, and global cooperation. The desire to meet human needs should drive emotions in international relations. And so emotional intelligence, emotional maturity then becomes critical. In conclusion, there is a continuing fight for Africa as various countries try to position their influence on the continent and harness its resources. This is the same for South Africa. Yes, there are tensions between US and South Africa. These have led to economic strain, strained relationships, and potential loss of benefits. But the focus for the presidency in South Africa should be on trade and infrastructural deals that will develop the country. President Ramaphosa's actions should reflect as a representative of Africa's most industrialized nation and not play into the emotions of Trump, a leader whose actions could be seen as erratic. The response by the diplomatic corps and foreign policy actors should remain professional, avoid escalation, focus on shared goals and mutual benefits of cooperation. It is important to present facts and address false narratives and perceptions. There is a need for a balance of firmness, diplomacy, and a commitment to finding solutions that benefit all parties. South Africa's engagement with the US should be driven by values that promote empathy, addressing human needs, and protecting South Africa's people and resources. A tit-for-tat approach does not benefit South Africa, especially when dealing with President Trump. Instead, the US and South Africa dynamics show the need for South Africa to explore other trade agreements, explore cooperative alliances, and build institutions with its counterparts in the continent and with countries that can foster shared prosperity. Dependency needs to be broken, and diplomacy is the tool to do so. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Professor Etang. I'm not sure if Zandile and her team are in the room. I can see that the heat in the room is having an impact on some of the members of the audience. And maybe if you can turn on the air conditioner, if that is possible. I do know that it's cold outside, and some people might feel that they're opposed to it, but maybe we'll feel better. We're almost done. Only 2 more speakers and a short engagement after that. Hopefully we will be done before 2 p.m. The time now is 13:23. Our next speaker is Dr. Thandiwe Khumalo, who is the head of applied law here at the Durban University of Technology.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, esteemed keynote speakers, panelists. Specific greetings to Prof. Netswera and Prof. Lawrence and all the DUT stakeholders at large. For me, it is a greatest honor to be part of this engagement this afternoon. And I'm not going to be long because most of the things has already been discussed by previous panelists and keynote speakers. On my part, I just want to highlight only on a few things. And at the same time, I'm just feel so privileged to be part of this engagement because it touches on issues of the past, and it also makes us to reflect on what is happening presently, and it also assists us to focus and actually look into what the future holds for us. So on that note, I just want to start the conversation by taking into cognizance of the fact that we are all aware that the relationship between South Africa and USA is complex. And perhaps the starting point is for us to quickly examine why it's so complex. And on my part, I'm left with only like few things that I just can highlight that form part of the historical background of the relationship. And I will quickly look into the apartheid era. During that time, what was the role of US, and quickly look into the post-apartheid, but I'm not going to be long and just go into detail. But in short, there's an inference that we can draw out of the relationship, and we can quickly scan into economic interest that both countries do have from each other, including job, trade, money, and businesses. And maybe lastly, focus on ideological differences between South Africa and US. And we'll be left with one conclusion. There are so many things that we differ. So on that note, since we are aware of our differences, what must be the main focus? The main focus is to actually check our relationship, more especially the trade relationship, international trade relationships that we do have, and how can we actually put together maybe a legal framework that can work for both countries. But I'm tempted to just reflect a little bit back. When Nelson Mandela was released in 1990, he visited US for the first time, and he was asked a question by Ted of ABC News. Why you actually embrace leaders like Gaddafi, like Arafat, like Fidel Castro? And his response to that, he said he was doing so because these individuals supported him and his organization in the struggle against apartheid. And he didn't stop there. He continued, he said that what we want to have friends, and we want to have as many friends as possible. And our attitudes will be determined by the attitude of the country towards our struggles. So that makes me to also concur with some of the speakers that there is a lot of uncertainty that is happening. You wake up in the morning and you hear news about this. That makes us to speculate. We're really not sure what's going to happen. And the question was asked by one of the panelists, are we ready? What will happen if the next morning the Third World War will come in? And I will agree with that maybe we need to also focus on strengthening the South African Defence Force. But otherwise, I'm not there. On this part, I just want us to zoom in on our foreign policy issues. And I'm left with no choice to say the policy for me, I can just say it is sufficient as a starting point. Okay? And on my part, I will just zoom into our constitution, which actually dictates the relationship with the global community, that actually highlights the fact that it should underpin by promotion of human rights, democracy, justice, and the rule of law. And on my part, I'm also forced again to reflect a little bit, just to check what went wrong that we can just highlight as a disagreement, fundamental disagreement between South Africa and USA. I can speculate and just say maybe it's our alignment with BRICS. I can just continue to speculate without further debating that the Israel and Palestine issue, our intervention, maybe. And on my part, I can just quickly zoom in as to what has recently happened, which I can just say so-called white genocide. And I think when you're looking into that and its own impact, and I will actually refer to it as a propaganda, because as South Africa, we know the truth of the matter. On our part, it left me with no choice to say that anything can happen. Maybe our legal system needs to be tested. I can agree that we do have so many pieces of legislation, whereby I can just count to say that 142 pieces of legislation, maybe even politicians are using them as a political football when they're about to actually canvass for election. Maybe they know how sensitive the issue it is. That is why this white genocide was highlighted. On my part, as I'm counting out of all of those pieces of legislation that are highlighted, are used sometimes as political football, I can count a piece of legislation like BBEE, equity, whatsoever, but we can just check the alignment of those particular pieces of legislation with the Constitution, taking into cognizance the historical background of South Africa and the need to address the imbalances of the past. But I am not going to focus mainly on that. I'm just going to touch again on the issue of the fact that we are aware as South Africans that obviously our sovereignty has been undermined. And the fact that our sovereignty has been undermined, it has been indicated by the fact that USA was able to come into our domestic affairs. Obviously, it's not the first time, and I don't think it's the last time. But the area of focus is just to check our trade laws. And obviously, other speakers have already highlighted about AGOA, which is a good piece of legislation that gives South Africa a preferential access to US markets with a boost of export and support job creation. We are happy about that. But the thing is that makes us worry so much is the way things and the events are turning up. Next morning you wake up, things are happening in a particular way. And we can see that there can be a possibility of us not benefiting to the very same piece of legislation. And then we really don't know what we can say about that. On that note, when we actually can fight for our recognition of South African sovereignty, the most and profound question can be asked, are we self-sustainable as a country? And so many presenters have actually alluded to that, highlighted so many points about what is happening, and we are all in South Africa and we know what is happening here. We are more consumers. And on my part, I will just highlight that if we can possibly look into that, and the way things are happening, it makes us to reflect that is it possible as South Africa to create a new relationship, not to only rely on US, although we know how powerful they are and what we are gaining from them. But I think it's high time for us to look further and to look within African countries to create more relationships that can actually help us to strengthen our economy. On my part, I just don't want to speculate much about the future, but you can see that obviously, as much as we want to have a good relationship with USA, but it is important that we really need to look internally as to what we can actually achieve. And DUT do have a lot of scholars, and I think it's high time for them to be also engaged in research to help to assist in creating maybe a geopolitical strategy that will assist in moving forward. But we are not going to ignore that it's possible that this relationship cannot be fully recovered, because at the end of the day, we are the country that needs to actually wake up as soon as possible and make sure that we are ready for whatever that can happen. And on my part, I just want to end it on that particular part. Although there are so many topics out of whatever that has been discussed, that scholars can choose to actually engage on further research as to what can be the way forward. So on my part, thank you on that.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khumalo. I heard you mentioning issues of football a little bit, but you did say political football when you spoke about those issues of football, Dr. Khumalo. All right. We have one final speaker, but before he comes up, I just need to mention that MEC Francois Rodgers might need to leave during that presentation by Professor Victor Ojakorodu, and because he does have another engagement after this particular meeting. But our final speaker is Professor Victor Ojakorodu, who is a scholar of international relations and a professor at Northwest University. He has published over 120 articles looking at issues of conflict resolution and international relations. Professor.
All right. Good afternoon, colleagues, and good afternoon, my predecessor that have spoken on the issues before us today. I just need to make some, maybe one or two clarifications before I proceed further to also speak about the topic before us. When you look at the issue of foreign policy, you see that there are different factors that determine a state foreign policy. And one of the key factors is personal idiosyncrasies of a leader. So you can imagine why Donald Trump is taking that position presently. Then it also goes beyond that. You also see that in terms of foreign policy, you see an ordinary individual in a country can influence a president to tour a position. And we now argue is the national interest of that particular country. And I'm sorry to say this, that concept itself has been subjected to abuse by politicians and policymakers. And you see a president will take a position and argue that is for the national interest. Which national interest? Is it for your own personal national interest or for the national interest of the state? Then secondly, the issue before us has been dealt with exhaustively by all my predecessors. I'm just going to add one or two things. The topic is political tension between South Africa and the US. What are the issues? What led to those tensions? And it has also been dealt with. Then, what are the likely solutions? I expected us to look at that and the suggestions. And it also, I must also emphasize here that it goes beyond South Africa. It also has implications for other African countries because South Africa is a prominent player in global politics. So we are not just looking at South Africa alone, we must also consider other actors, other states within the sub-region or the continent at large. And another area they left out is the impact of the tension itself on African Union. They've all suggested that we need unity, we need to diversify. But we must not forget the fact that it may also lead a sort of a division within African Union. You have the pro-West that will argue that, look, why don't we just leave it this way? Then you have others that will support South Africa, that South Africa should take a hard stand. And that will create a division among the states in Africa, which is also a key issue. On my own analysis or assessment of the crisis between South Africa and the US, there are two major factors that stands out. One, it is an identity politics. Then two, you look at materialism. These are the two key issues you have to consider when you are looking at the reason responsible for this, the reason responsible for that. And you must also look at it properly that these issues started before 7th of February 2025, before the executive order. Because there is this perception that the South African involvement with BRICS will create a sort of a contradiction with American policy in Africa. The problem have been on before the executive order, which some of them also touched about the historical complex relation between South Africa and the US. And when you look at all the factors that have been put forward by my colleagues, you see that the question we need to ask ourselves, how do we address this issue that will not only benefit South Africa, but will also benefit the rest of African countries? Because one of the other points, before I look at the two major suggestions I have, is that the crisis itself have internationalized the domestic problems we have as a result of disinformation, fake news. It has shifted focus from the internal contradictions you have within South Africa. Issue of inequality, issue of poverty, issue of employment. And I don't want to go into the consequence of the standoff between South Africa, because all those consequences have been dealt with. But what is the likely solution? Before you look at the solution, there are two scenarios. Either the crisis itself will worsen and downgrade the diplomatic relation between the two countries, or there will be a sort of a diplomatic relation negotiation that will bring about peace between the two countries. Those are the two scenarios. But now, what are the likely solutions to the problem that all of them have put forward? One, I have just two solutions before I close. One, I think South Africa should adopt what I call modern portfolio risk, or modern portfolio theory, or what I also call diplomatic portfolio theory. What I mean by this is that you cannot put all your resources into one industry. They've also mentioned diversification. What if something should happen to that industry tomorrow? What do you do? Which led to the diversification they suggested. Then the final point is, how do we turn the crisis situation into opportunity? It is true that it's going to affect South Africa. But we must also bear that it will also affect America, because they depend on some vital mineral resources from South Africa. So it's more or less like a double-edged sword. So if we are able to implement all the suggestions from Professor David, Dr. Mmusi Maimane, and the rest, we can address all the issues. We diversify. We have a new market. We have a new friends. So at the long run, we will be able to address the negative impact of the face-off between South Africa and US. I don't want to repeat what others have said. So those are just my few contributions to the discussion before us. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. Yes, sir. Okay, so there's a bit of a change in the proceedings. There are give backs that before the MEC steps away. It is 13:44 and the MEC has until 13:45 to step away. So I'm going to ask Zandile and team to then please step up to the front with those gifts, and then we're going to open it up to the Q&A after that.
We'll declare this as well, right? Thank you so much. Thank you.
Back to regular programming. All right, so I'm not going to, I'm going to try not to ask any questions if we do have questions out in the audience. If we can raise those hands. And maybe with the Q&A we can find some of those solutions that were asked for by Professor Victor Ojakorodu, because he did request that maybe we have some solutions, because everyone seems to have posed some questions. There's a hand up over there. Are there any more hands? There's a hand up. There's a hand. So let's do this. So it's one. We have a roving mic. 1, 2, 3, 4. They went up first. So gentleman with the short-sleeved shirt. And then there's the gentleman with the spectacles right in the end. Gentleman with the red hoodie on this side. And gentleman with the black top on this side. So let's take those first.
Thank you. I'll make a quick question to Dr. Maimane. Because Dr. Maimane spoke about inviting foreign direct investment. But how does Africa balance the need, the undisputable need for foreign direct investment, and what Dr. Etang was saying, or Prof. Etang was saying, is a new scramble for Africa. I say that specifically because he made an example of one of such people that can be attracted as BlackRock, and we know what BlackRock is doing throughout the world. I mean, it's one of the most odious companies that are, I would say American oligarchs that are fueling wars throughout the world. And how do you balance that need? How does Africa protect itself? And also, it has a bit of a point of what Prof. Breakfast was saying about Africa being African liberation movements not being able to call each other out. And these companies like BlackRock are well known for fomenting what are called color revolutions. So how do we insulate ourselves from that? Thank
you. Thank you very much. Actually, one question was for the MEC. He's gone. Around the 1960s, we had an influx of Chinese clothing and textiles, which decimated our local industries. And then about 10 years ago as well, the same thing happened with the Chinese vehicles. The question really was going to be, do we have any plans in place to beneficiate South Africa from the trade relationship with China? Because Prof. Mbandlwa, whether we like it or not, he mentions a truth, which is the fact that the relationship we have with China is exploitative at the West to us. We don't benefit much from it. And the second question is to Professor Breakfast. And this is where you mentioned that maybe let's try and do away with the double standards. The concern I have is the position that South Africa takes is not unique to it. For instance, in the Security Council, when a decision was to be taken on Ukraine, Russia vetoed as a permanent member state. And on Palestine issue as well, when a resolution was to be made, the USA vetoed. The USA is able to say, Mr. Putin is a war criminal, but is unable to say, Mr. Netanyahu is not. So then this issue of double standards is concerning because it's not unique to us. And one thing that is certain, there is an established practice in international relations of the national interest of the country, paving the way for the policy position of the country. So by saying that we should, if we are saying that Palestine is wrong, then Russia is wrong, are we not risking the isolation of South Africa in terms of its allies? Because clearly other players in the international plane, they align themselves with their national interests. Thank you very much.
Sorry, sir, who was the first question for? Was it for Honourable Maimane?
Yes, I will just pass it over to him now. Yes, yes.
Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and afternoon to everyone. I have two questions, one for Mr. Maimane and another for the rest of the panel. The first one says that, Mr. Maimane, do you believe that South Africa's non-aligned stance on global conflict, such as Ukraine and Russia, is a contributing factor to the USA and SA tensions? And the second one for the panel is that the land expropriation bill is one of the leading topics or factors causing tensions between two countries. And what is your take in this issue, and how do you think South Africa must stand its position regarding the execution of the bill, although Donald Trump condemns it? Thank you very much.
Sanbona. My question is to the whole panel. Anyone can just answer it. But my issue is with the issue of propaganda. The USA is notorious historically for, just putting out lies, saying there's arms of mass destruction going into Africa, destabilizing governments. And we've seen this throughout, obviously, the years. And now we have this issue of white genocide, still pushed by the USA, We also have another issue of where Burkina Faso, Ibrahim Traoré is liberating his country on the X streets, that's what they say. But the Americans, or America, is still moving in a different direction where Africa is actually trying to go. So why is the USA, how can I put this now? I feel that the USA has an issue of a united Africa rather than an issue on where to stand, because they know if we as Africans stand together, we are more powerful than any other continent. And they won't actually benefit as they're benefiting now from, obviously, their grip that they have by using the dollar. So, to the panel, what's your take on a united Africa and eliminating all the borders that we have in terms of visas and so forth. What's your take on that? Thank you.
All right, and thank you very much. And we do have question 5, and it says it's online. My question is directed at the Honourable Mr. Mmusi Maimane, referencing his recent appearance on the Sizwe for Walsh podcast. By way of brief background, I've served as lecturer at the Durban University of Technology for 25 years. While I may not feed bodies as farmers do, I take great pride in nourishing the minds of thousands of students through education. The question pertains to the intersection of education and human rights, with due regard for academic freedom and my fellow educators. Would a slogan as "kill the teacher, kill the onderwyser," if chanted, promoted, or left unchallenged, not constitute hate speech? Could it not risk inciting violence, especially among students? He does continue to share his views on this, but let's leave it at the question itself. Kill the teacher, kill the onderwyser. Basically, I think it's a play on kill the farmer, kill the poor, onderwyser. Kill the onderwyser. So that's what he wrote. So in terms of the individual as a university lecturer, so he's moving it from the farming community to the academic space. And if you replaced farmer with teacher, would it not constitute hate speech? So that is the question from our online audience member. All right, I think most of the questions are for you, Dr. Maimane. Maybe if you, yes, sir.
The only thing I wanted to ask, the Honourable Member was asking the question.
Yes.
I thought it was to Honourable Rodgers, so I didn't catch the gist of the question. If I can ask that question to be repeated.
Okay, there's one on the double standards, double standards that are not unique to South Africa. Was that your question, sir? Oh, no, this is plans to beneficiate South Africa on the trade relation between South Africa and China, and the view that it seems to be a one-sided relationship that is exploitative in terms of how South Africa perhaps doesn't benefit much from the relationship with China.
There's another one, I think.
We'll take one last round after this. There were others at the back as well.
Right, I'll try and do my best to be quick without trying to. I mean, I think the recent Economist writes this extensive issue about how do we move from financing not being an exclusive preserve of banking institutions, but equity holders, etc. And so BlackRock is an example in that light, not necessarily that I endorse BlackRock itself as an institution and some of the actions that it has taken. So I think that's an important distinction I need to make, and I appreciate the ills that have occurred with what BlackRock have done all over the world, and I'm not certainly endorsing of those views. I'm merely trying to allude to the point about the movement of capital, and perhaps maybe the point is even better punctuated by the statement I made that the sooner we create capital that is African-born, that is able to drive economic agenda, the better off we are in many ways. I think the second point that you make is also opposite. I think the question about balance, let me use Ghana, because we've just been dealing with the government there. Ghana is an incredible coffee industry. Right? Yet, much to my surprise, every hotel I stayed with when I was in Accra gave me Nescafe, which is Swiss. It tells the contradictory story that here you farm, and I think it speaks to the question of beneficiation broadly. But when I asked the question, what are the limitations? Ghana then said to me, we've got a number of limitations. The first is we don't have capital to build our own processing plants. And secondly, were we to do that, we would be exporting coffee at 6 to 7 times the value it is in, which they had a challenge with what the market's response to that particular issue is. So in your point about balance, I cannot stress enough the articulation of national interests, because countries that have been able to exploit the opportunities presented to them are quite clear about the fact that these are the things that we are fundamentally interested in. And that's why, for the purposes of South Africa, capital cannot move in South Africa without being able to complement South Africa's objectives. In fact, others would say it this way, that capital will follow your objectives if you are quite clear about those. And so for me, we have to be quite deliberate about saying, when you look at our broader, if you look at the last 10 years, which sectors have grown, which sectors have not, and which sectors have been able to have a follow-through on employment. So the financial services sector has grown in this country, but employment has not led in that sense, simply because maybe the financial sector is less job-intensive. But manufacturing has plummeted. Yet it gives us a massive opportunity that were we to grow the manufacturing, set out that as a critical objective to say, particularly here in KZN, I mean, I remember I used to manufacture shoes here, that what shoes, I can't remember what they were called. But they were made here. And part of the objective was economic development. We need to be able to restore that. And then, as even in my conversations recently with the Minister of Finance, I've been asking, I know many others have said we can't counter the tariff issue. But surely South Africa must be able to take a certain degree of protecting some of its industries from absolute exploitation. When you talk about the China relations, where t-shirts, we can't, it is improbable in my head that South Africa cannot manufacture its own t-shirts. It's illogical. We can't, in Limpopo, we can't even manufacture toothpicks. This is bizarre. Partly because we need to be able to be quite deliberate at saying, we will manufacture local, we will support local, and if anyone wants to move capital here, they need to get behind those objectives rather than us just being led by external markets in simplest sense, particularly on goods that we have minerals and resources for. But the last point I'd like to make is, it's a targeted integration strategy that deals with SADC. People have mentioned things like palladium and multiple. Some of those minerals aren't, some of them sit in the DRC, some of them sit within our neighbors. How do we not create a battery manufacturing center here so that we can be able to maximize that opportunity? Those objectives must be defined by us as Africans. The difficulty is that, and maybe we must be honest with ourselves, when you look at the electoral landscape of the continent, this is the bit that worries me. I must be careful how I say this because I don't want to demean anyone. But I'm concerned about the caliber of leaders that we are electing. We are electing people that want a vision for their nations. You go to Cameroon, the leader can't even walk straight. You go to other parts, you talk about democracy. How do we build democracy without Democrats? You tell me what the economic vision of, someone mentioned Frelimo. But when you look at the nature of why people are winning elections, it has got very little with human development. It often is about entrenching power. And as the Kenyans so eloquently put it, at first we must be liberated, and then we must liberate ourselves from the liberators. Because in truth, we're electing leaders that in many instances cannot give me an economic vision. So when you talk about balancing, what is out of balance is that Africa and many African economies tend to lead without being able to articulate what their economic objectives are, which puts them in a vulnerable space. For South Africa's purposes, I would rather be sitting here today saying, well, when we think about what the next transition is going to be, and I know we've had a big debate about coal versus green energy, but there are global standards that are able to allow us to farm coal, burn it for energy in a sustainable and a green manner. That's an objective we've got to deal with. And so, yes, we could go globally and say anyone wants to set up wind and all of that. I take the point. But that's not going to happen in the next decade, given the fact that our energy composition is 70% coal-driven. Yes, we might drive that down to 50, but we still have to answer the question, how do we farm it sustainably and align it with our critical objectives? So I guess the best way I can respond to the question is, whilst I get the geopolitical tensions, we have to ultimately deal with what we do as a country about setting our own objectives. I think I think someone raised the question about the non-aligned position that South Africa takes. India's taken a non-aligned position, and India's GDP growth is about 4% relative to where we sit at the moment, at 0.6%. I cannot bang on enough about being able to take a posture, as Modi took it, that says, we accept that there's a conflict in Ukraine, we accept there's a conflict in Russia, we have an energy relations with Russia, equally so, we have some trade arrangements with the Ukraine. And we are comfortable enough in being able to take that position and lead between the two. Have taken a non-aligned position, and I think India have come through this process well, because they've been consistent. Our dilemma is sometimes if you like, you take a position here on one issue, and on another similar circumstance, you take a completely different one. Then people don't know how to back. And there have been incidents of that. And so for me, if you take a non-aligned position, be consistent with that position, because then we can deal. I think it's always important to remind ourselves, of course, foreign policy isn't a perfect choice between good and bad. Sometimes foreign policy is a function of choosing between worse and much worse. So those are the nature of decisions you have to make. And you have to offer leadership consistent with your own posture as a country, but be consistent with that. And I think, as someone raised it here today, our cozying relationship amongst liberation parties has added to this problem of inconsistency, because Botswana has just held its election, they have a democratic election, a leader emerges there. Our president doesn't go. But Malawi has an election, and there are some, not Malawi, Mozambique has an election, and there are some serious challenges there. The president is there. ZANU have an election, and I'm convinced as I sit here, the elections in Zimbabwe are not free and fair. We can't milly-meal around this issue and pretend it makes sense. That is a sham of an election, and it must be condemned. But because of bilaterals between parties and ZANU, we tend to kind of go along to get along. It is consequential. So tomorrow, don't stand up and say, let's lock borders and make sure anyone who comes in here comes in free and fair, whilst you are not willing to stand up to parties that are rigging elections. I challenged our government. I said to them directly, when Malawi were rigging elections, where there's those TPEX elections that took place before the election of Lazarus Chakwera, I said, you should be at the forefront of fighting that. They said, no, we're here, it suits us. Let each country uphold its own sovereignty. I said, well then, fine. Accept the fact that then you will have an influx of immigration into your country. And by the way, I think someone asked the question, do I think of a united Africa and all of that? The dream, I think rather than us discussing borders and borderless Africa, we are better off discussing even how do we integrate trade in Africa. But integrating trade in Africa isn't going to just be a matter of policy, as the Africa Free Trade Area the limitations are infrastructure. It's easier for me to send T-shirts to Germany than it is to Ghana. Why? It will take me quicker to trade in an export market with other EU countries, including China and Asian countries, than it will within Africa. Give yourself a challenge. Try and move jeans from South Africa to Nigeria. See how quickly they will get there relative to moving jeans elsewhere. So if we really want to talk about an integration in Africa, let's really begin to lead with the idea of trade, because the legislation already exists. and then be able to say, how do we integrate that better through supplementary regulation, whether it be visas. There's a debate even currently about currency. What currency? You know, I find it, you know, I was in Tanzania. You arrive there, you are trying to trade, you're trying to buy things, and people are asking you for a currency you do not have at the point, and your payment gateways are frustrated through that. Now, I think if we really want to have an honest conversation about how do we trade within Africa, it's not going to be starting at let's just remove borders. I think that's the last place. But rather the first place is how do we integrate trade, how do we deal with better regulation, how do we build with infrastructure. And then I can promise you now, as night follows day, the borders will not matter. But if we obsess about borders and begin to bang on about that, I can assure you, you will never resolve the situation because each country's legislation are different in how it deals with its own neighbors. And then I think to the question that I sort of wanted to get more clarity on, of course, I would argue that when we move ahead, protecting some of your own industries against certainly, and tariffs are an important thing. SACU in South Africa gives us an opportunity to do that, the South African Customs Union, and how we deal with these issues, I think is going to be important for us in the future. And I can't stress enough, when Dr. Munyai said the preserve of foreign policy isn't limited to a party, the pain that I have to stress is that currently as things sit at the moment, I am myself puzzled by what the objectives of the GNU are. And because those objectives are obfuscated, you are going to have profound tensions around where we trade, how we trade, what we export, what we import, and it's going to be a future chronic situation until we get around, and I've called for the national dialogue, but moving beyond the national dialogue will require us to be able to say, rather than in the medium-term development plan expressing 31 priorities, I'm not sure how we get to 31 priorities, rather being able to articulate the few that are strong, so that when I arrive in Ghana, in elsewhere, I say, South Africa is going to be the next place for rail and logistics. Come and invest here because that is our priority as articulated by the government of the day. And that helps us lead diplomatically around trade rather than simply being going, we are just here for vibes. Thanks.
There was a question that wasn't taken care of, but maybe later. The question on kill the teacher that came from the online audience. And I do think there was a question that was specific for Professor Breakfast, if I'm not mistaken. Was it a question or a statement? Because when I read it, because it was an issue on double standards, right, and not being unique to South Africa. But it had been said it's a question directed at Professor Breakfast, but I'm not sure if it was a question or a statement, that South Africa is not the only country that has double standards. But maybe you can speak to that, because you had mentioned about, something about South Africa not choosing not to.
No, I think you are on point that double standards are not limited to us. But I say to that, two wrongs don't make a right. You cannot correct wrong with wrong. But also, if we are saying that we want to be above imperialism, above neocolonialism, I think we should do better. But also, the analogy which you are using, I think, I'm not trying to shoot down your argument, but it's off the mark. Because you are comparing us and the US. I mean, the US is the large financial contributor of the UN. So, you know what I mean? That's why, for instance, they can even sanction the judges of the ICJ. So I don't think that you should compare us and them, you know? Yeah. But the other example that I want to use to cement my argument, and I'm sorry if maybe I should not say this, I'm going to use Dr. Mmusi Maimane as a case in point. If he's not happy with this example, I can withdraw it. Dr. Mmusi Maimane, at some point, I can't remember when it was on a political mission to Zambia, and he was turned away, and his human rights were violated, but our government kept quiet. Yet on other matters we talk about human rights violations. I will leave it at that.
I'm not sure if any of our panelists would like to take any of those questions. They were...
Why do they do that? They kill the teacher.
Okay, you can take your kill the teacher.
I mean, look, the law is both in spirit and in letter. Now, this is where I maybe preach a little bit. Even the kill the boy, kill the farmer bit, our laws have dealt with that issue. Is it in the spirit of reconciliation is the question. I often say to our colleague, Honourable Malema, I sometimes ask him the question, whilst I appreciate, in the same way as you are quick to condemn disdain as a historical issue, and I see your protest, there is equally a protest around this issue. And does it speak to the broader question about reconciliation? I would be the first one to quickly condemn, and I would lead the charge. Anyone who wants to chant, kill the teacher in this country, in democratic South Africa, is inciting violence. And in my view, I would think, given that it has it is within a new context, that would be seen as hate speech. Whether that materializes or not, I think it puts our teachers in a vulnerable space. And I'm not certainly here trying to be populist. I think people who want to introduce rhetoric and language like that in a democracy as fragile as ours should be conscious of the fact that now in that instance, they are not only going against the spirit of reconciliation, they are ultimately going against the constitution of the country in both letter and law. And so to be definitive, I do think it's hate speech and I do think it should be condemned. Thank you.
All right, so one last round of questions. We have 6 esteemed academics and Mr. Maimane as well, or Dr. Maimane, as he will be receiving that PhD at UJ pretty soon. So there was the hand in pink, there was the hand over, so just these 5 and nobody else after this. So it's 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. So yes, please.
Greetings to everyone in the room. A question directed to Mr. Mmusi Maimane. As the former DA leader in this country, and you are running up for elections to be president, and my question to you is that if you were in Mr. President Ramaphosa's shoes, what would you be doing at the moment if you had been the one that had won the elections? Thank you.
Sanbon, greetings to the panelists and everyone who's present. I have a lot of comments and also I think a few questions thereafter. The panelists have spoken about the leadership crisis that we have as a country, which is mostly, I think, at the first point of departure that we must speak about, because we have a lot of people that are leading, but they are not leading based on the interest of those people that they are leading. They are leading based on the interest that they have. For an example, in a democratic country, we have a president that is a businessman. Maybe if we're going to speak about the tension that we have in the White House, we must also include those things that maybe at some point he didn't went there as the president of the country, but he went there to resolve some issues that are pertaining his businesses somewhere else. But again, I like the last professor that spoke about the integration of African continent. And maybe at some point, as the youth, because it's us, we are young, we are energetic, and we want to take over this country and make sure that it's given the dignity and its sovereignty is not compromised as it is currently. We must speak about building strong relations amongst the African countries. And one of those things in building those African relations, it's an identity policy crisis that we have, or that the government is failing to identify. Maybe at some point we should be, we must excel with ourselves. Maybe at some point we should go into that. Because what I've seen as the young person that is growing, and the leadership organ, the government that we have doesn't have a backbone. It's just the government that is there. So we need a strong government that's going to have a backbone in terms of taking issues that we are going to face moving forward as a country.
Could I ask you to please, you said something ngesiZulu, which was umnixela with ourselves, loosely translated, not give ourselves fully. Yeah. But what are we not giving ourselves fully to in your statement or question when you say kumele sinixele with ourselves?
Yes, I mean like we must not give ourselves into those European countries that are taking advantage of us, just like what has happened in the White House. Because my observation is that the president gave himself too fully to the president of the USA, which is Trump, where he wasn't supposed to. There are questions that he was not supposed to answer. The one of propaganda, of genocide in South Africa, that one was not supposed to be answered because it's incorrectly. And even the president of USA, he knows that. But because of trying to mitigate and trying to do something, hence why it gave in the narrative that maybe, probably, there is a genocide. That question was not supposed to be answered. He was just supposed to leave it there because it's upon himself. My question, maybe to not waste much of the time, Mr. Maimane, is to ask, and then onto the fellow panelists, that...
last one. You've raised a couple of points.
Yes.
So this is, I believe, is point number 4.
Yes.
So last one.
Which trade partners do we need as a country? Do we need trade partners that are Africa-based, or do we need trade partners that are all over continent, excluding USA? Because I think, as a young person, they don't need them currently. Thank you.
Greetings. My name is Mmusi Maimane. My question is directed to the 3 professors on the end, or it's more or less of a proposal. You spoke about manufacturing, us manufacturing our our own goods. Here in South Africa, we do have companies. Someone mentioned something about toothpicks. We do have companies that manufacture things like plates, maybe black-owned companies. When I was in primary school, we were taught how to make plates as a project, like proper plates. But you would find that you would go to Checkers, you would see made in China, everything made in China. So I think we should invest more in those small companies that are, I would say, black-owned, or I don't know who owns them, but we should. But they are South African companies. And also with relations to foreign countries, such as African countries, we do have a lot of manufactured, such as vehicles, electric vehicles. We have the electric vehicle in Burkina Faso. We have an electric vehicle in Burkina Faso. It is manufactured there. It is an African continent, African country. But then we'll find that us as South Africans won't have interest in buying those cars or bringing those cars here in South Africa. We also have one that is made by a guy in Ghana. I think it Kantana, something like that, Kantaka. in Ghana. It's a proper vehicle made in Africa. But you will find that we would go to Japan and bring in Toyotas here, but you know, those cars, they are there and they are working. They are there, but we don't have an interest in our neighboring countries. Someone spoke about why isn't China bringing a manufacturer here? It goes to the question of also nuclear. I would say we also need nuclear power stations. Russia has about 38 nuclears. We have only 2, and I don't think we hardly recognize those nuclear power stations. So I would say, with regards to BRICS as well, we should, 1 minute, oh, okay, remember that. We should also have an interest in also bringing those manufacturings here, teaching our people here as well. And then the last question, maybe just a question to Honourable Mmusi Maimane. It is with regards to the SANDF. I know some of the panelists spoke about SANDF. We had a nuclear power station in the 70s, 1970, 1980, and it was disarmed. We are the only country in the world who had a nuclear weapon, and we disarmed it. I would like to know why it is directed to Dr. Mmusi Maimane. Thank you.
Guys, can I ask that we keep it brief? Like, it seems like we all want to ask 6 questions each. There's a gentleman there, and then there's one gentleman somewhere this side. So those are the last 2.
Greetings everyone in the house. My name is Ernest Despansum Africa Manogara. I'm a DUT student and a member of the community. I only got 2 questions. The first question is directed to Professor Mbanjwa. No, I'm not sure if I'm... Mbanjwa, yes, thank you. So, Professor, you spoke of the youth and said Africa is the future in terms of the youth population. But my concern, I would like to know in what perspective are you putting it? We are the majority of the youth globally as Africans, because I also believe that the statistics are just numbers, but what matters is the quality over quantity. So I want to refer that since you are the majority of the youth, do you see this majority of the youth being capable to lead globally one day? And how do you see if the youth that we have is much capable got those qualities of leading globally? Because I mean, like, if you can take a look now in this majority of the youth, how many like the population that got interest in things that are very important to the growth of our economy as Africans, and those who take things seriously globally in leading. And that's my question. So the second question goes to Dr. Victor. Doctor, I want to ask in terms of, say, you said if there are crises like this happening right now between South Africa and the US, and we should see an opportunity to have alternative ways. So I would like to ask maybe that what are those alternative, or so what's the point of departure from now to in the current situation with South Africa and the US? So as a South African, what can we say? What we can say, okay, now we are taking a stand, or we are taking this point of departure to resolve what is the issue that is happening currently. Thank you very much.
All right, there's one last one at the front. Can I ask for one microphone to come to the front as well, so maybe they don't have to constantly walk up to the podium. There's one gentleman over there. That's the last question.
Greetings. My name is Anile Ngalane. Greetings to the panelists. Thank you for this opportunity. Congratulations to Dr. Maimane for attaining his PhD in advance. But today I would like to invite you to wear your hat as a member of parliament. So, honorable member, your role is to keep the executive accountable, such as the President of South Africa, which is President Ramaphosa. Excuse me, I know you might not be part of this portfolio committee, which is communications and technology. But please assist in answering this question. Do you think that the visits in Washington yielded positive results, and what would you say about the proposal made to ease triple BE laws to allow companies such as Sterling to operate in South Africa? This brings me to my second question. Africa shouldn't be viewed as beggars or dealt with out of generosity. There should be equality among sovereign nations. This was a bold claim made by our president last year in a global financing pact summit in France, which was hosted by President Macron. I'm so happy that the issue of emotions was dealt with by Prof. Dorcas, because I believe in the visits to Washington, this issue was very vital, and there had to be a balance of emotions. But my concern is, and this is posed to Prof. Breakfast, Prof. Moe, and Prof. Dorcas. I think you've answered this question about foreign policy, but I want you to give me an explicit answer around this. In the United States, Ramaphosa's posture in the Oval Office is viewed by many as contrary to that claim which he made in the Global Pact Summit, that we shouldn't be viewed as beggars. We should be treated as equals as nations. But it seems that his posture that he took was ironic. We were viewed as beggars because I fail to understand why would we pacify another sovereign lead? Because he represents his own interest, and we represent our own interest. This raises questions about the consistency of our foreign policy and whether we have adopted a selective approach to which countries the Western powers should appeal to. Isn't this problematic? And that is why we find ourselves... tell us. Isn't this problematic? And as a result, as a country, we find ourselves entangled in these geopolitical tensions. There was a question about why we didn't take the steps.
Brother man.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right, I think there were several questions, and I think any of our esteemed professors can actually answer to those questions. But I see you have the microphone, Prof. Mbandra. Maybe take the one you want.
Yeah, thank you so much, Program Director. I'll just answer one question that was directed to me. But one must say, I really appreciate the fact that colleagues who are sitting on the other side, I don't want to say you are an audience because we are also an audience. You have educated us today on many issues. And I really appreciate the fact that there is a real need for us as the country to have a manufacturing plant where we are producing not just consumers. But maybe before I respond to the question, let me just take you to our well-distinguished scholar by the name of Frantz Fanon, before we articulate the issue of the youth in Africa, whereby we have 70% of young people who are below 30 in Africa, which is not happening elsewhere in the world. This continent is blessed by having many young people. Frantz Fanon once said, each generation must, out of relative obscurity, discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it. So in other words, the future is young. Young people are the future. Well, I don't think you can have a 70-year or 80 years professor. That professor will not have a significant contribution than you. You can do things that that person has failed to do because you still have time on your side. So, and that is the main problem that you have in the country, whereby in Japan, they are lacking young people in Japan. As we speak now, they have increased the retirement age so that there will be a continuous economic activities in the country. But in South Africa, or in Africa for that matter, we have many young people, and the majority of the young people are not economically active. And that alone creates a problem. Not that they don't want to, but because those who are probably not young anymore do not want to leave a legacy for young people to take forward. And that is the main problem that you have in Africa, whereby you have leaders in Africa who are 80 years, 90 years. What are you going to do as the president who is 80 years? You don't even know how to use your laptop or your computer or your phone. You rely on your PA to help you. What are you going to do? There are countries such as Switzerland, whereby many young people, and female in particular, it is led by the young cabinet, many young people who are below 40. In South Africa, a young person is someone who is 50. In Africa, for that matter, when you are 50, they say you are young. Whereas some countries are doing great in terms of transferring the skills. And I think, especially young people in South Africa, if we zoom in into South Africa, as we speak now, is holding the G20 presidency. But if I were to ask some of you here who are young, what does this mean for us as South Africa? And this conference, this summit, this presidency is in Africa for the first time in the history of G20. And if I were to ask young people, they don't know what is G20, they don't know what it means for South Africa to host a G20 presidency from last year November to this year November. They don't know about the Y20 that we have, what it stands for. They don't know about B20. They don't know about E20. All those things, these are there in the public domain. But if we were, and I'm very active on TikTok, but I've not seen anyone saying anything about G20 presidency. But I see people who cheated, who slept with, who did this and that. But we are failing to articulate critical issues, especially young people, which address issues of the future. Thanks.
I suppose maybe if we can, because the actual question, I think you evaded it, but you did touch on it a little bit. So it was, you said Africa rather is 70% young, right? But what is the quality of the youth? And also, what determines quality as well? Because while we're having that discussion, what determines quality of the youth in order for them to make a meaningful contribution? And I would believe that it's not just in terms of political leadership and being in politics and deposing of the 80-year-old leader. Surely it's not just in politics. So maybe to the rest of the academics, the quality of the youth and what determines that quality.
Right, thank you. Your questions, I suggested that South Africa should take the opportunity of the crisis situation to diversify, because South Africa cannot control American trade policy. In that context, South Africa should come up with another alternative to the crisis situation, either by improving the infrastructural facility or strengthening trade relations with other African countries, as suggested by my co-panelists, or strengthening trade relations with other European power, and most especially with BRICS. With that, South Africa will be able to cover the shortfall that we eventually come out of AGOA situation. If at the long run, South Africa is pushed out or excluded. Because you must also know that it is very difficult to repeal the AGOA because it needs the attention of a US legislature. But the country's involvement can be reviewed, members can be reviewed annually. And that is what I meant by that South Africa should take that opportunity either to strengthen their trade relations with the rest of Africa or with members of BRICS or other trading partner from the European world. Thank you.
Anybody else who wants to take any of the questions that are asked? All right, yes, Puff.
I think a number of questions have been posed, so I'm going to make a statement that touches on some of them. Let's face it, we are a nation of 61, 62, 63, it depends who is counting, million. That number, it's very small, and I must say, in the bigger picture of things, in global politics, might not be sufficient to push some of the agendas that we wish for. You're negotiating with China with 1.4 billion people. You come with your 63 million. The imbalance is massive. So it is important to ensure that you are better off if you are negotiating with China as SADC or negotiating with China as the African continent. Because you have numbers. So that's point number one. Numbers matter in international relations. Number two, beyond numbers, and perhaps answer some of the question about quantity and quality of youthness. The world is moving very fast. One of the major things that is happening at the moment, to put it very simply, it is that the countries that used to be the core leaders, you driving Toyotas, and all these American cars, and they are no longer leading. They are no longer as dominant as they used to. They no longer have dominance in terms of the market share. They're being displaced. And you cannot just give up power. No one gives up power, patiently waiting to be just taken off. They're fighting back. So what we are seeing is what we call geoeconomics. It's no longer like the last Cold War. It was about ideology. The fight we're having, it's about Starlink, it's about Huawei, Apple, it's about cables, it's about satellites, it's about science and technology, of which your university is called science and technology. So we have to think far deeper and answer the question, in this huge fight over technological advancement, what contribution are we making to ensure that we are competitive in the forefront? Yes, you can beat on the Chinese, whatever you say about them, right or wrong, in terms of displacing the cotton industry or any other. It's not just South Africa, it's a global phenomenon. So I think the bigger question is that we need to rethink advantages we have in terms of population, that youth, not just youth numbers, but a highly skilled youth. That's the quality question. And skills in what? In relevant skills, in what is core to ensure that we compete with China, we compete with the United States, we compete with BRICS countries as well. So I think we need to think much more deeper than we are doing at the moment. So we need to go beyond slogans and concentrate on what is practical. I do not see anything wrong with our foreign policy. We just need to rethink and waste time in terms of complaining about what the West is doing. We need to ensure that we secure our region, we secure our continent. Not from just each other, but from the people that we think are investors, because they're coming here. Go and read the illegal flows of capital. Someone was talking about capital. Africa is losing more than gaining in so-called investors. We need investments, but the amount of money that is being wasted, companies are not paying tax. Why? Because some of our bureaucrats, some are corrupt, not all. Some just don't have the skills to tax. So taxation, it's important. And we need to open these borders in terms of movement of these goods and know how to tax and know how to keep money in Africa and ensure that everyone who comes to this continent, money remains on this continent. As it stands, the bulk of resources are taken out without more remaining here to create more jobs. So I think we need to create jobs by what we have. So we need to think deeper and be serious as youth, as scholars, and as politicians. We have to think. No one is coming to rescue us. We're going to rescue ourselves. Either this ship is going to sink. It's all hands on deck. So that's what White House conversation, the outcome. So whether you want to shout, kill the Boer, or whatever you want to say, or sending delegates to speak ill of your government and your country, you're wasting your time. No one cares about you. You have to care about your country, your people, and you need to unite and present a common position, but at the same time, upskilling your people and do the right thing, which is less crime, basic issues. I mean, robots that can't work for every week, you fix it tomorrow, it's off. It has come to an end. We have to be serious. If it means we kill tenders, kill them. So you have to ensure that the bureaucracy is serious. We need to declare corruption as crime against humanity. We have to be serious. If we don't, no one else will do that. And we'll keep on having these meetings endlessly. So you hear my views. Thank you.
Prophet Tang, and then we will wrap up with Honourable Maimane. Prophet Tang first.
Yes, thank you very much. I actually think President Ramaphosa handled himself well in the Oval Office. When you're dealing with someone who is very aggressive and emotional, it is important to have a level of maturity. And I think sometimes we portray a message of you need to be a bully, you need to be aggressive, you need to be loud. And sometimes that's not the way to go. I think if we always went that way, the world will be in more chaos than it is now. And I want to just emphasize some of the points that have been made. We have a leadership crisis on the continent. And many of the problems we're seeing and experiencing is because we have failed to get leadership right. On the other hand, I think we blame government for everything, and we fail to take responsibility as citizens. What is my role in my community? What is my role when it comes to elections, when it comes to governance? We vote these people into power, and they perform poorly, and then we vote them again. So I think sometimes we need to shift from focusing on the state and its failure and look at citizens. How are we mobilizing? How are we bringing about change? How are we supporting change makers? Thank you.
There's a button, but you can use that one.
Yeah, thanks for the questions. And I want to, along with the panelists, there's a lot to take away and there's a lot to think about. And I think it underlines the fact that we're living in a very complex world. You know, when people talk about tariffs, we make them as like these broad statements. But if you're planning as an economist and you're thinking, when President Trump wakes up in the morning and announces a tariff, the cost on exports in this country changes. When he adjusts that same statement later on in the afternoon, how do you plan in a universe where one individual, depending on which side of the bed they wake up on, can determine the nature of how you respond? It's complex. It's complicated because all of us here today, you might have multi-choice or DSTV, but DSTV's biggest competition is not whatever the other one South Africa has come up with. It's the fact that it's competing with Netflix and companies that are not in this jurisdiction. So their tax base is not here. So how do you keep multi-choice as a sustainable business here in South Africa when it's no longer competing here? You, as young people, I hate to break the news to you, you are not competing with the person next to you. You are competing with a worker in China. You are competing with a worker in the US, because that's the world we live in. So we have to, as South Africa, appreciate complexity and stop trying to solve the problems of our parents, but figure out how to solve the problems of our children. That's the hard yards. So let me say this. There have been many questions, but I think China gives us some excellent way of thinking. You may not agree with everything that happens in China. You may not agree with their track record on human rights or whatever. I'm not here to defend everything. I'm just here to say there's a lesson to learn. When I was growing up in the 80s, I'm still young. Someone said when you are under 50, you are a young person. I am a young person then. But when I was growing up, China used to be seen as this country that's backward. China. Forget the things of the Chinas, of the Chinese people. Forget it. That was how we were. Today, no one can say that. What has happened in that period of time? Because China were facing the same problems we were. They were hurtling towards over 1 billion people. They had to answer the economic problems. But what did they do? And I think there's some lessons here to learn. They looked at their population and asked the question, how do we manage this? South Africa is hurtling towards 1.4 billion people by 2040. Let me give you the sad news. If we do nothing about moving 300 million people from poverty to the middle class, you will have deaths in this continent like never seen before. Because our health facilities and our tax base is not going to manage with that situation. So we have to answer that question. And China were deliberate. You may not like what they did. I'm just telling you they were answering questions for them. I always like when people say African solutions to African problems. I say, yes, be clear about what are African problems and how, tell me what your solutions then. Then we work towards that. The second issue is that China was clear about its vision. And its vision was not next week. It was 10 years, 20 years. And now, if you speak about what's going on in China today, it's an articulation of a vision that was born a number of decades ago. What is our that? And in Africa, the African Union talks about the 2063 issue, but there's no work happening towards that project. The third issue is China had to make choices. I remember the global West making huge noise about how China it moved away from the dictum of how do we do currency and how that currency is pegged against the world. The Chinese currency was allowed to literally sink to the bottom, but they knew it suited their export markets. And that's what they focused on. But they made a choice. Sometimes my biggest pain as a legislator, someone said to me, wear your hat as a legislator. My pain about South Africa is that we can't choose. We don't make choices, we just do everything because we hope we'll get everything. But now we are hitting a point where financially we have to choose. You can't have everyone on a grant. At some point you have to choose. You can't have every model of, you've got to make some tough choices. And that's my fear as a legislator, is that we can't do that. Because our leadership is not deliberate at saying, well, actually, we may have thought the world like this, now we are making a choice today. This is the choice, this is the direction we are going to go. Those are choices you have to make, and China had to do that. You have to say to yourself, how do you move people how do you build new cities? It's a deliberative action, and China did that. Today, when you look at the city infrastructure all across the country, it is collapsing. And so, these are realities. I mean, I lament. Next year, load shedding will be able to vote. You can't be in a country where a problem has gone on for 18 years. It's madness. It means you can't solve your problems. So, these are deliberative actions that we have to take and stop sloganizing and industrialize. So, for our own picture and our own country and our own situation, If we are clear, we've got to be articulate and be clear about our... You may not like President Mbeki, but you were not confused about what his thoughts were economically. He launched papers. You can debate gear, you can debate Asgisa, you can debate, what was the other one? NGP. But they existed for you to debate. What is the national consensus today? What is the document? People talk about NDP. The targets of the NDP are sitting at 40-odd% targets. Talk about medium-term development plan. Even that is insufficient. So let's be clear about our own priorities and what we do. And so to answer your question, if I took the leadership question, let's narrow our priorities to 5 or 6. Let's be intentional about pursuing those. You can't live in a country where, the professor said something that stuck a core with me. Domestic problems are becoming internationalized through social media. Now, in that situation, the Afrikaners were able to get the plight of farm workers into the White House. 44 farm murders took place last year. That issue was at the White House. 75 are being murdered every single day, of which the majority are in townships. Do you see anyone in the township going anywhere else? We've become comfortable with a country that has, if you lined up the coffins of people who have died in this country, you'd start in Cape Town and end up near Egypt. We can't be comfortable with madness. We must declare a state of emergency on murder. But to do that, you then have to say, when you appropriate money for policing and the NPA and all of those institutions that ensure that the criminal justice system works, you've got to say, I'm going to cut from here to fund those ones because I'm now fighting crime. But when you look at our budget, Honourable Rodgers is correct. We just take last year's figures, adjust for inflation, and hope for the best. When we keep doing that for the next medium term and the next 10 years, we're going to achieve exactly the same outcomes as we are today. We have to make some deliberative choices, learn from what China has done, and ultimately say to ourselves, as the continent of Africa, when someone was asking me about even the South African National Defence Force, the Defence Force collapsed because we took money from, during COVID, because South Africa was in a fiscally difficult situation, we took the entire budget, nearly of defense, and moved it to COVID interventions. That about brought the army to its knees. And then, in a chronic deployment to the DRC, we sent our young people there to die. I have to say that with respect. Because they were undercapacitated, underfunded from the time they left. And then when you add COVID to that, you can talk about disarmament of nuclear, etc. The defense review strategy that we are putting on the table now, the bottom line of it is that it requires additional and new funding towards the defense. And yes, you have to weigh that priority against an aging army that must attract new young people relative to other priorities that you've got to fund for. Do I believe we need a strong army? Yes, I do. Do I think the new defense review strategy will work? I think it will. But it is going to require funding. But what we cannot do, and this is my worry for the state, and I'll leave it with that point. When you look at the South African R1 that comes into the fiscus, 22 cents of it goes to debt, 38 cents of it goes to cost of employees, and the majority of the balance of that goes to welfare. So we have to rejig that whole thing. Because if you say to me, what's the funding for the army? The majority is into personnel. The army isn't funding new equipment, new defense technologies. It isn't doing that. So we have to, at the end of the day, and I'm not going to pronounce here because these are ideological questions and certain issues, but the sooner we begin to make choices about the country we want to live in, and be clear about what sacrifices are going to come, because they are going to come. Your province, KZN, is going to run out of teachers. It's the fact of life. Until we have to say, what choices do we make? The ratio of healthcare, doctors to patients, relative to international benchmarking, is woeful. So, all I'm challenging us to do as a nation is to stop talking in romantic language. Let's eventually lift the rock, see what sits underneath there, and then say to ourselves, let us make the hard choices. Because when we do that, I think citizens who say, maybe this year I'm not going to receive as much of an increase in the grant, but I know it's funding a hospital down the road for my parents, for my grandparents, then we are making different sets of choices. What was at the White House? I know there are different views about whether we were successful or not. That's not for me to pontificate on. All I can pontificate on is whether, if you are watching that, would you wake up tomorrow morning and say, this is a country I want to invest in? Whatever your answer is in that question, that's what will determine whether we were successful at the White House or not. Thanks.
All right, so we're being left with another question. So where is Zandile? Because we need a warm day in spring again when the room is full, and not in summer. Because I almost died in my first summer in Durban. So it needs to be spring or autumn in Durban, and then have these discussions again, because more questions were raised on this stage again as we are ending. I'm going to call on Professor Melanie Lawrence, who's the Deputy Dean at the Faculty of Management Sciences here at DUT.
Thank you, Program Director. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, from my side. I've been tasked with the vote of thanks, and I think taking into consideration the tremendous amount of information that has been shared this morning and this afternoon in this room, it is a tall order. First of all, a very big thank you to all our panelists, the profs in our midst, the doctors in our midst, the doctor-to-be in our midst. And I was actually sitting there and thinking that at DUT we're going to be introducing the Viva Voce, which is basically an oral defense. And I think this is like a trial run for our students to see what an oral defense. I see Prof. Breakfast is going, yes. And it's amazing to see also the interaction that we've had from our student side. And from an old lady, I'm above 50, so Prof. Fulu and I, we're not in the young category anymore. From an old lady's point of view, I was really hoping to see more students here today. And whatever we do at DUT, and I think whatever our colleagues on the stage does on a daily basis, it is for the next generation. And we must also encourage our next generation to take care of themselves as well. I also want to thank the organizers, which are three very special young ladies and gentlemen. Zandile is our journalist in the faculty. She is accompanied by Skumbuso and by Tommy, and they have been driving this whole event from day one. I also want to give a big thank you to our Department of Hospitality and Tourism students who have assisted us throughout this morning, as well as our audiovisual. Thank you very much for being with us. And then I want to end off by thanking a very significant individual in our faculty, and that's our Executive Dean, Prof. Fulu. Profi has always, since day one that he joined us in the faculty, he always said, you know, you need to encourage our bundle of joys to interact. If they talk about things, they learn. And if you look at today's interaction, international business, labor law, trade, emotional intelligence, the list goes on that have been covered. So I really want to put a call out to our students and also our student governance bodies at DUT. If these opportunities present themselves, please encourage your peers to come along. Because if you take away one thing here today and you sit for 5 minutes this evening on your own and you say that today I've learned this, or I realize I can become more passionate about this or that, mission accomplished. So ladies and gentlemen, with no further ado, I want to wish you a productive afternoon further. Please travel safely. I don't know if the wind is still blowing the way it was this morning outside. And a big thank you from our side.
Prof. Furufero Netwera, I'm going to ask you again to come to the proper front to present gifts to the remaining members of our panel. All right, and ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us, and that's the end of our proceedings. I'm going to ask Zandile and Skumbuzo to give direction to our panelists on where we go after this, but everybody else, thank you very much for joining us today.